August Voss stepped into the crowded auction yard at Briar Hollow like he owned every plank of wood beneath his boots. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The men around him stepped aside the way water parts for stone, not out of respect exactly, but out of that particular kind of fear that wears respect as a costume. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that cost more than most families in Wyoming Territory earned in a season. His eyes moved across the crowd the way a man surveys property he hasn't bothered to visit in a while, unhurried, proprietary, faintly contemptuous. Then he found what he was looking for. She was standing near the far corral fence, her back to him, her dark hair tucked under a worn hat, wearing the long-sleeved dress she never removed no matter the weather. Even from 40 yards away, August recognized the particular way she held her shoulders drawn slightly inward, the posture of a woman who had spent years trying to take up less space. He smiled. He took a folded document from his breast pocket, smoothed it once against his palm, and handed it to the man standing beside him, a thick-necked lawyer from Cheyenne named Dorset. "Serve it before she moves," August said quietly. Dorset crossed the yard in 12 steps. He tapped the woman on the shoulder. She turned, and August Voss watched Lenora's face go white as December. "Miss Voss," Dorset said, loud enough that the nearest ranchers could hear, "you are hereby notified that your guardian, Mr. August Voss, holds current legal authority over your person and your inheritance under the Wyoming Territorial Incompetency Statute. You are required to accompany. She's not going anywhere." The voice came from behind August. He turned slowly. Gideon Rusk stood 10 feet away, arms loose at his sides, jaw set, eyes the color of a sky about to do something unpleasant. August looked at him the way a man looks at a dog that has wandered into the wrong yard. "This is a legal matter," August said. "Stay out of it." "I'm standing on my own land," Gideon said. "You stay out of it." August smiled again, the kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes. "Not for much longer," he said. "Before you find out what happens next, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, right now is a good time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done, leave a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every single comment means something to me. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what August Voss did to Lenora, you need to know what she survived just to get here. She arrived in Briar Hollow on a Tuesday in late July, which was the worst possible time to arrive anywhere in Wyoming Territory. The heat came off the ground in visible waves, the kind of heat that makes horses lay their ears flat and men say very little. The stage from Casper had been running 3 hours late, and Lenora Voss stepped off it with one carpet bag, $14.60 in a cloth pouch pinned inside her dress, and the specific exhaustion of someone who had not slept soundly in 8 months. She was 23 years old. She was what the women in whatever town she'd passed through last called a substantial girl when they were being polite, though they hadn't always been polite. She had a full, heavy figure, dark hair that curled at the temples in the humidity, bunned one mise, and a face that would have been called handsome if more people had thought to look at it carefully enough instead of stopping at the rest of her. She wore a long-sleeved dress in the middle of July. She wore it buttoned to the wrist. She had worn something like it every day for the past 4 years. The first thing she did when she stepped off the stage was check the street in both directions. Not like a tourist taking in the scenery, like someone calculating exits. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the nearest building with a sign she could read. The Briar Hollow Mercantile smelled like leather oil and dried beans, and the woman behind the counter 50-ish, sharp-eyed, hair gone silver at the temples, looked Lenora over once without comment, which Lenora appreciated more than the woman could have known. "Help you," the woman said. "I'm looking for work," Lenora said. "Any kind. I'm not particular about what it is." The woman studied her. "You come in on the stage?" "Yes, ma'am. Passing through or staying." Lenora set her bag down on the floor beside the counter. "Staying. If there's something worth staying for." The woman's name turned out to be Ruth Callis. She ran the mercantile with her husband, who was currently out back arguing with a delivery driver. Ruth was the kind of woman who asked direct questions and formed opinions quickly, and her opinion of Lenora formed in approximately the time it took Lenora to answer 3 of them without flinching. There's not much in town, Ruth said. The hotel takes a girl sometimes for laundry, but Mira Hatch, who does it now, needs the work something fierce. Hendricks at the feed barn takes seasonal hands. She stopped. She tilted her head slightly. You know horses some, Lenora said. How much is some? Lenora thought about how to answer that. Enough that I'm not afraid of them, she said, even when I probably should be. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and produced a stub of pencil and a scrap of brown paper. She wrote something and pushed it across the counter. Blackthorn Ranch, Ruth said, about 4 miles north. Gideon Rusk owns it. He's been short-handed since his last 2 stable hands quit in June. She paused. The reason they quit is that he's got a stallion nobody can manage. Tried to put 3 men in the hospital. Rusk won't sell it and won't put it down, which tells you something about the man. What does it tell me? Lenora asked. Ruth considered. That he's either very patient or very stubborn. Possibly both. She tapped the paper. He doesn't pay much, but he's fair and he keeps to himself. That last part, he keeps to himself, was the part that decided it. Lenora folded the paper, put it in her bag, and thanked Ruth Callis without elaborating on why that particular quality mattered more to her right now than the pay. She walked the 4 miles to Blackthorn Ranch in the afternoon heat. The ranch sat in a wide grass-yellow valley with the Wind River Range visible in the distant north blue and white and enormous, the kind of landscape that makes human problems feel appropriately small. The main house was plain and practical weathered gray, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front. The barn was larger than the house, which told Lenora something about where the owner's priorities lived. There were 4 hands visible when she walked through the gate, 2 fixing fence line near the east pasture, 1 working a young mare in the near corral, 1 hauling water. They all looked at her. 2 of them looked at her, the way men look at a woman they've decided something about before she opens her mouth. The other 2 just looked, which was neutral enough. She found Gideon Rusk standing outside the main barn with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, watching the man in the corral, with an expression that suggested he was seeing something the man wasn't doing right, but had decided not to say so yet. He was taller than she'd expected from Ruth's description, which hadn't included height. 36, maybe 37, built like a man who'd spent 20 years doing physical work and hadn't given it up. Brown hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had argued with a few things over the years and lost some of those arguments. He was not a handsome man in any polished sense, but there was something in the way he stood still, watchful, economical, that communicated a kind of competence Lenora had learned to pay attention to. He heard her footsteps and turned. She handed him the piece of brown paper before he could speak. Ruth Callis sent me, she said. I heard you need stable hands. I'm looking for work. Gideon looked at the paper. He looked at her, not the way the 2 men at the fence had looked, not assessing, not dismissive. Just looking, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. You know horses, he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth said she told you I said some. She's being modest on my behalf. I know horses. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The position pays $6 a week, he said. Room in the bunkhouse. I've got a separate quarter at the end for female hands. Had it built 2 years ago. Meals included. Work starts at 5:30. What work? Lenora asked. Feed, water, clean stalls, exercise the horses that can be exercised, he paused. And there's one that can't yet. A stallion named Reckoning. 17 hands, probably 7 years old. Previous owner, he stopped. Something crossed his face. Previous owner wasn't kind to him. He'll take your arm off if you go in wrong. My last 2 stable hands found that out. Are they all right? Gideon blinked. It seemed like an unexpected question. They are, he said. Nothing permanent. But they didn't come back. Lenora looked toward the barn. Can I see him? You've been here 4 minutes. I know. Can I see him? Another one of those not quite smiles. He gestured toward the barn. The stallion was in the last stall on the left, a big dark-coated animal with a deep chest and eyes that had the particular expression of something that has decided the world is against it and intends to be ready. He had a scar along his left shoulder, raised and pale, that Lenora noticed immediately. He pinned his ears the moment she appeared in the doorway, and swung his head toward her with a sharp warning motion. Lenora stopped walking. She stood in the doorway and did nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't reach for him. She just stood there and breathed, slow, and even the way you breathe when you want to convince something that you're not a threat, which sometimes worked on horses and sometimes worked on people and didn't always feel that different. Reckoning watched her. After about 2 minutes, his ears moved not forward exactly, but out of that hard-pinned position. A small shift, barely visible. Gideon was standing 6 feet behind her. She heard him go quiet in a particular way, the way a man goes quiet when he's noticed something he didn't expect. She took 1 step into the stall, just one. Then she stopped again. The stallion didn't lunge. She waited. She took another step. Miss Gideon started. "Give me a minute," she said without turning. She heard him stop. She spent the next 8 minutes moving slowly across that stall, doing nothing aggressive, nothing sudden, making herself into something that just existed in the same space as the horse, without demanding anything. By the end of it, she was standing 2 feet from Reckoning's shoulder, and he was watching her with those damaged eyes wary still, and not fixed, not anywhere near fixed, but not lunging. She walked out of the stall, slid the bolt, and turned around. "When do I start?" she said. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 5:30. The first week at Blackthorn Ranch was the kind of hard that Lenora had come to prefer over the alternative work that consumed the body and left the mind with less room for the things it liked to circle back to at night. She was up before anyone else, had the first round of feeding done by the time the other hands arrived, and had cleaned 4 stalls by 7 in the morning. Nobody had asked her to move that fast. She just did. The other hands were a mixed collection. There was Pete Garland, who was 40-something and laconic and fair, and who after 3 days decided Lenora knew what she was doing and treated her accordingly. There was a young man named Cobb who was maybe 19 and kept looking at her in ways she recognized and ignored. There was a hand called Stetson, not his real name, but no one called him anything else, who was quiet and competent and mostly indifferent to everything, which Lenora found restful. The fourth hand, a man named Rourke, had opinions. He didn't state them directly, at least not at first. He stated them sideways, the way certain men do, leaving just enough space so they could deny it later. On Wednesday of the first week, he came into the barn while Lenora was mixing grain and made a comment about how it was something. A woman her size hauling feed bags all day. Was she sure she wasn't overtaxing herself? He said it with a smile that he probably thought was friendly. Lenora measured out the grain, added the supplement, checked the proportions, and said without looking up, "All 4 of those feed bags got moved." "You're welcome." Rourke's smile went a little fixed. He didn't say much to her directly after that. What he did say, she heard from Pete on Friday afternoon. That she was taking up a spot that should go to someone who could do the real work. That Rusk had gone soft hiring charity cases. That a woman built like that didn't belong in a working stable. Lenora heard it and kept her face level and said nothing to Pete except "thanks for telling me," and went back to what she was doing. That evening she spent 45 minutes with Reckoning. The stallion was still volatile, still reading every human interaction as a probable threat, but he'd begun to recognize her footstep before she arrived at his stall. Not welcoming it, not yet, but recognizing it. There was a difference. She talked to him while she worked. Not sweet talk, not hoarse whispering nonsense. Just talking about what she was doing, what she could see through the barn door, what the weather felt like that morning. Normal, ordinary things. The sound of a voice that wasn't raised. On Friday evening, Gideon appeared at the end of the barn while she was finishing up. He stood with his shoulder against the wall, the way he often did like. He'd arrived there by coincidence and happened to be watching. "Rourke's been running his mouth," he said. "I know." "You want me to say something to him?" Lenora looked at him. "No. Why not?" "Because then I'm the woman who needed you to fight her battles," she said. "And I'm not." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. "But if it gets to the point where it's affecting the work." "It won't," Lenora said. "Because I'm better at the work than he is, and he knows it, and in another 2 weeks everyone else will know it too." Gideon considered that. 2 weeks? "Maybe less," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let it get that far. Then he nodded once and left. She watched him go. She noted, carefully, and without letting herself attach too much to it, that he had not argued with her. He hadn't insisted he knew better. He hadn't told her what she should do. He'd asked a question, heard the answer, and accepted it. She noted it and put it away and went back to reckoning. 11 days after Lenora arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, reckoning let her touch his neck. It happened on a Thursday morning, earlier than she usually came, while the sky was still that deep pre-dawn blue, and the barn smelled of hay and the particular silence that exists before animals fully wake. She had been standing near his shoulder for 20 minutes, breathing slow, doing nothing. And then the stallion moved his head just slightly, and the side of his jaw grazed her hand. Not an accident. She knew horses well enough to know it wasn't an accident. She kept her hand where it was. She didn't press. She just let him find her. After a moment, she moved her fingers very slowly along the line of his jaw, up toward his ear, into the heavy muscle of his neck. He didn't bolt. He didn't swing his head. He stood and trembled slightly, the way a creature stands when it's allowing something it's not entirely sure about, but is choosing to allow anyway. She stayed with him for another hour. When she came out of the barn, Gideon was standing near the water trough with a coffee cup in his hand, watching the sky go orange over the eastern hills. He hadn't seen her yet. She almost walked past without speaking. Then he said, without turning, "How's he doing?" She stopped. "He let me touch him this morning." Gideon turned and looked at her over the rim of the cup. His expression was complicated in a way she hadn't seen on his face before. Like he'd expected to be pleased and found himself more than that. "You're serious," he said. He moved toward me, she said. "That's different from tolerating." He chose it. Gideon looked toward the barn. He looked back at her. "You been with horses a long time?" "Since I was 9, she said. "My father kept them. He was the one who taught me." She paused. "He died 4 years ago." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It had just followed the first part the way things do when your guards slips in the early morning. Gideon didn't ask what happened after. He didn't fill the space with condolences or pivot to something easier. He just nodded, a small grave nod, and said, "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She walked toward the bunkhouse to get ready for the day's work. She was 20 feet away when she heard him say quietly, almost to himself, 9 years old. She didn't stop, but she heard it. The storm came in from the northwest on a Saturday, which nobody had predicted, and everybody should have. The sky had been wrong all day, that particular yellowish tint at the edges that Lenora had learned to read as trouble, but the hands were occupied with a cattle count in the south pasture, and nobody was watching the horizon closely enough. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind was coming hard, and by 4:30, the first lightning was hitting the ridgeline to the west. Horses don't reason their way through fear. They respond to it purely completely, in the way that only bodies can. Every animal in the barn was affected, dancing in place, white showing around the eyes, but reckoning was something else. He hit the back wall of his stall so hard the boards cracked. He screamed, not a neigh, a scream, and started spinning in the confined space, which was how horses hurt themselves badly when they were past thinking. Lenora heard it from the bunkhouse 30 yards away and was already running before anyone had time to form a plan. She came through the barn doors into chaos. The other horses were pulling at their ties, the sound of hooves on wood everywhere, the storm crashing outside so loud you could feel it. Reckoning had gotten himself half sideways. One hind leg caught between the stall boards, his weight driving against it, and in another 30 seconds, he was going to either pull free or break the leg. "Get back!" she shouted at Cobb, who was standing frozen in the middle of the barn not 10 feet from the stall. She didn't wait to see if he moved. She went straight to the stall door. "Easy," she said. Just the one word. Said it the way she'd said everything to him for 11 days level, ordinary, like weather that wouldn't change. Reckoning heard her. She couldn't have explained it to anyone who'd ask. He heard her voice the way he'd heard her footstep, as something that had not yet hurt him, and the screaming cut down to a hard, fast breathing, still panicked but fractionally less than a second ago. She got the stall door open. She moved to his shoulder, not to the front of him, and put both hands on him flat palms, firm, the pressure that says, "I know you're here," and she talked to him. Just talked. The storm crashing outside, her voice the one steady thing. His leg was wedged badly. She had to work it free from an awkward angle, one hand pressing his hindquarters back to relieve the pressure while the other worked the caught leg loose. It took 3 minutes that felt like 20. Her arms were shaking by the end of it. When the leg came free, Reckoning lurched forward hard, sudden, the way a panicked animal moves when it's no longer physically trapped but hasn't figured that out yet. His shoulder hit her and drove her sideways into the stall wall. She heard someone shout her name, and then Gideon was there, one arm around her waist, pulling her out of the stall while Reckoning spun and crashed, and finally got himself to the far corner, and stood there shaking. Still frightened, but no longer in immediate danger of killing himself. Gideon got her through the stall door and pushed it shut with his shoulder and turned to look at her. "Are you—" He started. "I'm fine," she said, too fast. "You hit that wall hard." I said, "I'm fine." She pulled her arm free of his grip. She pulled it harder than she needed to, hard enough that the sleeve of her dress caught on his hand on the rough callus of his palm, and the fabric tore. Not all the way, just a few inches, just enough. Gideon went completely still. Lenora felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of stillness that means something has changed in the room. She looked down. The tear in her sleeve had pulled back far enough to expose part of her forearm. The scars were not subtle. They were not old enough to be pale or faded. They were raised and uneven and ran in patterns that made it clear they had not happened by accident. The barn was loud storm outside, horses shifting, Cobb somewhere behind them calling to Stetson. In the middle of all of that, Gideon said nothing. He looked at her arm. He looked at her face. Lenora watched his expression and waited for it, the pity, the horror, the questions she didn't want to answer, the particular look men got when they believed you needed saving and intended to be the one who did it. Gideon Rusk did none of those things. He reached up and removed his coat, a heavy canvas work coat, smelling of horse and wood smoke. He placed it around her shoulders, carefully, without letting his hands touch her skin. Then he turned to Cobb and Stetson and said, loudly and firmly, "Get the other horses settled. Now. I need everyone on the far end." There was a moment where nobody moved. "Now," he said again. They moved. Lenora stood in his coat and looked at the floor. Her face was doing things she couldn't control, the particular tremble of a person who has been braced against something for so long that being asked to lower the guard is almost worse than the threat itself. After everyone else had moved to the far end of the barn, Gideon crouched down slightly so he was at her eye level. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. His voice was completely level. Not gentle in a condescending way, just level, steady. The same way she'd talked to Reckoning. "Not tonight. Not ever. That's your choice." She looked at him. "But I need to know one thing," he said. "Is whoever did that to you looking for you?" The question hit her differently than she expected. Not what happened, and not who hurt you, and not are you all right, which were the questions that required her to explain, to perform her own injury for someone else's understanding. Just, is there a threat I need to know about? It was a practical question. A specific one. And it told her something. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe," she said. Gideon nodded once. "Then we'll handle it," he said. "Not I'll handle it. She noticed that too." She told him that night. She had not intended to. She had gone back to the bunkhouse after the storm passed and the horses were settled, and she had sat on the edge of her cot in the dark for an hour, listening to the rain still tapping on the roof, thinking about the fact that she'd been here less than 2 weeks, and someone had already seen. Someone had seen, and the world had not ended, and that particular man had looked at her as if she were still exactly who she'd been 60 seconds before. She got up, put his coat back on, and went to the main house. She knocked. He answered in 30 seconds, which meant he hadn't been asleep either. They sat at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee that went cold while she talked, because she hadn't sat down to talk in 4 years, and once she started, it moved like a thing that had been dammed up. Not a flood exactly, but a steady, relentless current. Her father had owned a small freight company in Laramie. August Voss had been his business partner, clever, personable, the kind of man who seemed indispensable until you looked at the books. When her father got sick, he'd brought August in closer, trusted him with more, and August had leveraged that trust into something that looked like partnership and functioned like a trap. Her father died when Lenora was 19. He died believing August was a good man. August had produced documents papers Lenora later understood her father had signed without reading carefully because he was in pain and confused and trusting giving August control of the company, and through the company, control of Lenora's inheritance until she either married or turned 25. She was 23. He isolated me first, she said, and her voice was careful and factual in the way a voice gets when it's been trained to not do the other thing. Told me I didn't understand business, that I needed to be protected from people who'd take advantage. Which she paused, which was him, taking advantage. He said the inheritance was nearly gone because of my father's debts, and I believed it because I didn't know any better. He told me no man would want a woman my size. He said it enough times that she stopped. I started to believe it. Gideon had his elbows on the table and his hands wrapped around the coffee cup. He said nothing. He just stayed exactly where he was, which was the right thing. The scars started the second year, she said. Not all at once. Just when I pushed back on something. When I asked questions he didn't want. He made it seem like discipline. Like correction. Like I'd done something that made it necessary. She looked up. It took me until last November to understand that I hadn't done anything that made it necessary, she said. That there wasn't anything I could do or not do. That the only thing that would end it was leaving. So you left, Gideon said. I left, she said. I took the account ledgers. He kept them in the office. I'd watched where he put the key for 3 years. I took the ledgers, and I took what cash was in the drawer, and I walked out in January in the dark. The ledgers, Gideon said slowly. What's in them? Lenora looked at him. Proof that there were no debts when my father died, she said. Proof that August has been moving money out of the inheritance account for 3 years. Into another business. A cattle company. Gideon went still in a different way than before. A cattle company, he repeated. One called Bracken Cattle, she said. In Briar Hollow, Wyoming. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Silas Bracken, Gideon said. You know him. I know him, Gideon said. His voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard from him before. He's been trying to acquire land in this valley for 2 years. Bought out 3 ranches that were struggling. He offered to buy mine 6 months ago. He paused. I said no. He's going to try again, Lenora said. The money August moved, it's in Bracken's operating accounts. If someone followed the ledger entries, they could trace it. Gideon looked at her for a long time. Where are the ledgers, he said. In my bag, she said, under the floorboard of my bunk. He nodded slowly. Outside, the storm had dropped to a murmur. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular closeness of a room where 2 people have been talking honestly for the first time in a long time. You could have taken those ledgers to a lawyer, Gideon said. 8 months ago. Why didn't you? It was a fair question. She'd asked herself the same thing. Because August would have had me declared incompetent before any lawyer could read the first page, she said. He'd already been laying the groundwork. I overheard him talking to a judge in Laramie before I left. There's a statute, the Territorial Incompetency Statute. He could use it to have a court declare me unfit to manage my own affairs. Then the inheritance stays under his control regardless of the ledgers. But if you go to court with the ledgers and evidence of the fraud, then it's a different matter, she said. Then it's not a woman being declared incompetent. It's a man being declared a thief. She paused. But I need to get there first. I need to get there before he finds me and serves the incompetency papers. She looked at her hands on the table. Her left sleeve had slid down, and she didn't push it up. He's been looking, she said. I know he has. I've been careful, but I'm not invisible. She almost laughed at that, a short, bitter sound. No one's ever accused me of being invisible. Gideon looked at her then in a way she hadn't expected, not with pity and not with something she'd need to manage. He looked at her like she was someone who had done something difficult and kept doing it. We'll contact a territorial lawyer in Casper, he said. First thing Monday, before Bracken knows you're here. She blinked. You're working on my ranch, he said. That makes whatever comes next partially my problem. It doesn't, she said. You didn't hire anyone's problems. No, he agreed. But I hired a woman who spent 11 days earning the trust of a horse nobody else could get near. and who threw herself into danger tonight to save an animal that had no particular reason to trust her yet. He paused. I make my own decisions about what's my problem. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the barn. All right, she said finally, not because she couldn't have argued, but because she'd been arguing alone for 8 months, and for one night she was tired. She took his cold coffee cup, got up, poured them both fresh cups, and put his back in front of him. She sat down. Tell me about Bracken, she said. Gideon wrapped his hands around the cup and began to talk. And neither one of them went to sleep until nearly 2 in the morning, which was, the first time in 8 months that stayed somewhere past the point where she thought she should leave. The lawyer in Casper was named Aldrich Fenn, and he was not an encouraging man. He was 60-something, thin in the way that suggested a life of sitting at desks and worrying, with a pair of spectacles he kept removing and replacing, as he read through the ledger pages Lenora had spread across his desk. He read slowly. He made sounds, small, non-committal sounds, that could have meant anything. And every time he made one, Lenora felt the particular tightening in her chest that came with waiting for someone to tell her the things she didn't want to hear. Gideon sat beside her and said nothing. He'd said very little since they'd left Briar Hollow that morning, which she'd initially taken for indifference, and then understood was simply how he operated in situations where speaking wouldn't improve anything. Fenn set down the last page. He removed his spectacles. He looked at Lenora over the top of them. These are legitimate business records, he said. The entries here, he tapped a column on the 3rd page. These transfers, if I'm reading them correctly, represent a systematic redirection of funds from the Voss inheritance account into operating capital for Bracken Cattle Company over a period of approximately 31 months. That's what I've been saying, Lenora said. I know what you've been saying, Miss Voss. I'm confirming that the documents support it. He replaced the spectacles. The problem is not the evidence. The problem is jurisdiction and timing. August Voss is a resident of Laramie County. The alleged fraud occurred in Laramie County. A Casper attorney filing on your behalf would— How long? Gideon said. Fenn looked at him. Pardon? How long before you can file something that freezes Voss's ability to invoke the incompetency statute? That's what she needs first. Everything else follows from that. Fenn blinked. He looked at Gideon with the mild surprise of a man who'd expected to be the most informed person in the room and found the distinction contested. 2 weeks minimum, he said. Realistically, 3. Lenora did the arithmetic before the sentence was finished. 3 weeks. August had been searching for 8 months. He'd been closing in. She'd felt it the way you feel weather changing before you can see it, and 3 weeks was a long time when someone was already looking. File what you can now, she said. Whatever partial filing stops the incompetency proceeding. I'll sign anything that needs signing today. Fenn considered. There's a protective motion I can file in territorial court here in Casper that would complicate any incompetency action while the fraud investigation is pending. It's not a guarantee, but it creates a legal obstacle. File it, Lenora said. It requires a corroborating affidavit from a witness familiar with your situation, Fenn said. He looked at Gideon. Gideon pulled his chair forward and picked up the pen from Fenn's desk. Tell me where to sign, he said. Lenora watched that. The speed of it, no deliberation, no conditions. She watched it and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been too much. They left Fenn's office with a copy of the filed motion, a receipt, and the cold certainty that a legal document in Casper was not going to be enough by itself. In the wagon on the way back, Gideon drove, and Lenora watched the landscape go past scrub and sage, and the distant hills going purple in the afternoon light. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe less, he said. Fenn's cautious. They usually land faster than they estimate, and if August moves faster than Fenn estimates. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with that when it happens. She looked at him. That's not a plan. No, he agreed. But we don't have enough information yet to make a better one. He paused. We do know that Bracken is his connection here, which means Bracken knows you're in Briar Hollow now, or he will very soon. And Bracken has eyes all over this valley. Has anyone told you directly that Bracken's been watching your ranch? Not in those words, Gideon said. But 2 months ago, a hand I had to let go, Mercer, good worker, I didn't have enough in the payroll to keep him through winter turned up working for Bracken inside of a week. Now, that could be coincidence. He said it the way a man says something he doesn't believe. But Mercer knew the layout of Blackthorn, knew which pastures we run and what the breeding schedule is. And about 3 weeks after he started at Bracken's place, someone cut 2 sections of my east fence line. Let a dozen head onto the road. Lenora turned this over. Bracken's building something, she said. Acquiring land, building leverage. August's money gives him operating capital. Your land. My valley access is worth more than the land itself, Gideon said. There's a water source on the northeast corner of my property. Natural spring fed by the runoff from the ridge. Whoever controls that water in a drought year controls every ranch in a 20-mile radius. She understood then, with the specific clarity that comes from recognizing a pattern you've seen before. That's what August is using Bracken for, she said. Not just hiding money, building an asset, land and water rights that increase in value year by year. While I can't prove any of it, Gideon said, and while you're running out of time. The wagon rolled on. The wind off the mountains was cold even in August, which was something Lenora was still adjusting to. I need to see the ledgers again tonight, she said. I want to trace every transfer to Bracken's operating accounts. If we can show specific dollar amounts moving at specific dates and cross-reference those against Bracken's land acquisitions, that's months of legal work. Or it's a week of careful reading, she said. I grew up watching my father manage accounts. I understand what I'm looking at in those books. She paused. I just need time to do it without looking over my shoulder. Gideon glanced at her. You've got the ranch, he said. Take whatever time you need. She almost said thank you. She stopped herself. Thank you felt too small, and she didn't want to be someone who filled the space with inadequate words just because silence was uncomfortable. Instead, she looked back at the road and said, Tell me everything you know about Bracken's land purchases. Every property, every price you know, every seller. And for the next hour and a half, while the wagon moved through the late afternoon, Gideon talked, and Lenora listened and committed everything to the same careful part of her mind that had memorized those ledger entries 1 page at a time. The news came to Briar Hollow the following Thursday in the form of a writer from the stage office, who delivered a letter addressed to Silas Bracken that the station master in Casper had already, unfortunately, opened and read as station masters sometimes do when they're curious men, and the seal is already loose, and had mentioned to his wife, who mentioned it to her cousin, who drove supply wagons between Casper and Briar Hollow twice a week. By Friday morning, half the town knew that August Voss of Laramie was offering a $100 finder's fee for information about the location of his ward, a young woman of approximately 23 years, heavy-set, dark-haired, last seen traveling by stage toward central Wyoming. $100 was 4 months' wages for most men in Briar Hollow. Ruth Callis heard it from 3 different people by 9 in the morning, and she closed the mercantile at 9:15 and walked the 4 miles to Blackthorn Ranch herself, arriving dusty and out of breath and in no mood for indirection. She found Lenora in the far corral working reckoning on a long line, not riding him, just asking him to move in circles, to respond to changes in pressure, to accept direction without panic. The stallion had come far enough in 3 weeks that he would accept the halter in the line, which was more progress than anyone at the ranch had expected. Stop what you're doing, Ruth said. Lenora looked at her. She read the woman's face in about 2 seconds. She brought reckoning to a halt, handed the line to Pete, who'd been watching from the fence, and climbed out of the corral. Ruth told her. Lenora listened without interrupting. Her face didn't change while Ruth talked, which Ruth found either admirable or alarming. She couldn't decide which. When Ruth finished, Lenora said, When did the letter arrive in Casper? Tuesday, by the cousin's account. So Bracken's known since Tuesday. That's 3 days, Lenora calculated. He'll want to confirm I'm here before he contacts August. He won't want to collect the money and be wrong. So he's watching. Ruth stared at her. You're very calm for someone with $100 on her head. Being calm is the only thing I've got to work with right now, Lenora said. She wasn't being philosophical. It was just accurate. She went to find Gideon. He was in the barn replacing a hinge on the tack room door, which was a piece of work that didn't strictly require his presence, but which he'd apparently decided to oversee anyway. He saw her face as she came in and put down the hinge. She told him. He listened the same way he always listened, entirely, without fidgeting or interrupting. Bracken already knows, he said when she finished. Probably, which means he's deciding whether it's worth the risk of calling August in. It's worth the risk, Lenora said. $100 in finder's fee, and whatever arrangement he has with August for the ongoing operation. That's not a small number. No, Gideon said. He was quiet for a moment. The barn smelled like fresh wood shavings and oil. I want to move the ledgers. They're safe under. They were safe when nobody knew to look, he said. Bracken has people who move around this ranch without our knowing. I'd rather not bet everything on a floorboard. Lenora thought about it. He wasn't wrong. Where? There's a lockbox at the Briar Hollow bank, he said. Hartwell runs it. He's not a friend of Bracken's. Bracken tried to buy the building last year, and Hartwell told him to go to hell in those exact words, which I appreciate about the man. A bank lockbox is public record, Lenora said. Anyone can find out I rented it. The box is in my name, Gideon said. Already is. I keep deed copies in it. He paused. I'd need to add items. That's a normal thing. Nobody looks twice. She looked at him. This was the second time he'd offered something that put his own position at risk. The affidavit in Casper, and now this. She was starting to recognize the pattern, and it made her feel something she wasn't entirely prepared for, which was a different kind of unsettled than the fear. If Bracken finds out you're holding my evidence, she started. He can find out whatever he wants, Gideon said. It won't change what I do. She almost pushed back. She'd been pushing back for 8 months from habit because it had been safer to rely on nothing and no one. Instead, she said, all right, tonight. He nodded. Then there's something else, she said. He waited. Ruth says people in town are talking about the finder's fee. Not all of them will ignore it. She paused. If someone decides $100 is worth turning me in. Then we deal with that too, he said. You keep saying that, she said. Because it keeps being true, he said, without particular heat. She looked at him for a moment. This man, who was not elegant, who was frequently blunt, who had a temper she'd seen him fight to keep in check twice already, who had extended himself for a woman he'd known 3 weeks in ways that would cost him if things went wrong. Why, she said. He looked back at her with that direct, unsentimental gaze. Why what? Why does it keep being your problem? You could step back. Make it clear I'm just an employee. Nobody could blame you for it. Gideon considered the question as if it genuinely required consideration. Because stepping back would be the wrong thing to do, he said. I don't need a complicated reason beyond that. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she intended. Then she looked away first, which she noticed. Tonight then, she said. After dark. The man who told Bracken was not Rourke, which surprised Lenora when she found out, because she'd been watching Rourke. It was Cobb, the 19-year-old, the one who'd gone still in the barn during the storm. He'd apparently ridden into town on his day off Sunday and ended up at the saloon. And Bracken's foreman, a heavy-set man named Creighton, who was good at buying drinks for people at the right moments, had drawn the conversation around to Blackthorn Ranch, the way you ease a boat downstream. And Cobb had been drinking on an empty stomach, and by the end of the evening he'd confirmed what Bracken already suspected. There was a young woman working at Blackthorn, heavy-set, dark-haired, kept to herself, wore long sleeves in the summer. Pete told Gideon on Monday. Gideon called Cobb into the barn, closed the door, and had a conversation Lenora wasn't present for, but heard about from Pete afterward. Cobb was apparently crying by the end of it, which Pete recounted without satisfaction. Gideon told the boy he wasn't fired, because Cobb hadn't known what he was doing, and because firing him wouldn't undo anything, but that from here on out, if Cobb said one more word about Lenora or about the ranch's business to anyone in town, he was done. And that if Creighton bought him another drink, Cobb should pour it on the floor. When Lenora heard this, she found Gideon splitting wood behind the bunkhouse. You should have let him go, she said. Gideon split a log, set the halves aside, and positioned another. He's 19 and he was stupid. Those aren't the same thing as dishonest. He put me at risk. He did, Gideon said, and he knows it now. That's going to sit with him longer than losing the job would. He split another log. Besides, if I fire every hand who does something stupid, I'll be working this ranch alone. Lenora stood there. She wanted to argue with his logic and found she couldn't, which irritated her slightly. "You're too patient," she said. He glanced up. "You're the woman who spent 3 weeks working with a horse that tried to put 3 men in the hospital," he said. "I'm not sure you're the right person to tell me I'm too patient." She opened her mouth and then closed it again. He had a point. She turned and walked back toward the barn, and she was fairly sure she heard him make that almost law sound behind her, but she didn't turn around to confirm it. Bracken came to Blackthorn Ranch the following Wednesday. He came in the middle of the morning, which was deliberate mid-morning, was when the hands were scattered and the ranch felt emptier than it was. He came with 2 men, which was also deliberate. He came in a good coat on a good horse, and he had the kind of face that had learned to look reasonable over years of being unreasonable. Silas Bracken was 54, not tall but wide-shouldered, with a jaw that seemed built for decisions and a smile that appeared slightly too quickly, like something pulled on a cord. He had deep-set eyes the color of creek water in fall, not brown, not green, some unhappy middle color, and he used them the way he used everything, to assess, to calculate, to find the angle. He found Gideon at the fence line on the east pasture and rode up without announcement. "Rusk," he said, friendly, not pretending to be anything he wasn't, except for the friendliness, which he was definitely pretending. "Bracken," Gideon said. He'd been fixing wire. He didn't put down the pliers. Bracken looked around at the pasture, at the cattle, at the distant line of the barn, taking inventory, which he probably thought was subtle. "I heard you hired new help recently," Bracken said. "I hire help when I need it," Gideon said. "Stable hand, I heard." "A woman." Gideon pulled a section of wire taut and set a staple. "You ride out here to discuss my hiring practices?" Bracken smiled. "Just being neighborly." "We're not neighbors," Gideon said. "My nearest neighbor's the Perrin place, 3 miles west. You're 4 miles southeast of that." Bracken let the smile go. He tried a different register, something closer to candor, which in his hands was just a better-dressed version of the same calculation. "I'll be straight with you, Rusk," he said. "I have a business associate in Laramie." "August Voss," Gideon said. A pause. Bracken recalibrated. "You know the name." "I know several things," Gideon said. He turned and looked up at Bracken on the horse. "I know that Voss is looking for a woman he claims is his ward. I know he's offering a finder's fee, and I know that you've been connected financially to Voss's operation for at least 3 years. He paused. "I also know that a territorial protective motion was filed in Casper 6 days ago, establishing that the woman in question is the subject of an active fraud investigation, and that any attempt to detain or remove her by force would constitute interference with a legal proceeding." This was not entirely how Fenn had described the motion, but it wasn't exactly wrong either. Bracken's expression cycled through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, anger, and then back to something approaching calm, because he was a man who'd had practice keeping his face in order under pressure. "That's a lot of legal language for a cattleman," Bracken said. "I read carefully when it matters," Gideon said. Bracken looked at him for a long moment. His 2 men were sitting their horses behind him, not speaking, the kind of men who were there to look heavy, not to talk. "Voss is going to come here," Bracken said. It was no longer pretending to be neighborly. "In person. He's a patient man, but he's been looking for 8 months, and he's not going to stop at a motion from some Casper lawyer." "I expect not," Gideon said. "And when he does come," Bracken said, "you're going to want to have thought carefully about what side of this you're standing on. August Voss has a long reach in this territory. So does the law," Gideon said. "When someone hands it the right documents." Bracken studied him. The friendly face was fully gone now. What was left was more honest. A man who had spent years getting what he wanted, through money and pressure, and the careful application of other people's cooperation, looking at something that wasn't going to cooperate. "You're making a mistake," Bracken said. "I've made worse," Gideon said. He turned back to the fence wire. "Come back when you have something worth talking about." Bracken sat his horse for another 10 seconds, long enough to be a statement, and not long enough to be a confrontation he couldn't win, then turned and rode away with his 2 men behind him. Gideon finished setting the staple. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the wire, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went to find Lenora. She was in the barn with Reckoning when Gideon came in and described the conversation. She listened while running a brush through the stallion's main reckoning, tolerating it now with only an occasional side-eye, which was progress nobody would have believed a month ago. He'll contact August tonight, she said. Tonight or tomorrow morning, Gideon agreed. Which means August could be in Briar Hollow within a week. She worked through a tangle in the main. Fen said 3 weeks. Fen can work faster, Gideon said. Can he? He can if I explain the timeline has changed. He leaned against the stall door. I'll go to Casper day after tomorrow. Send a telegram, she said. Some conversations need to be in person, and if Bracken or one of his people follows you to Casper and sees you meeting with Fen. Gideon paused. He hadn't thought that far. She watched him catch up to the problem. Then they know we're moving faster than they expected, he said. Which isn't necessarily bad. It is if they decide to move faster too, Lenora said. August arriving before Fen files the full fraud complaint means I'm exposed. The protective motion buys time. It doesn't win anything. I need the fraud filing. Gideon was quiet. Outside, one of the mares called to something in the south pasture. What do you need to finish documenting the transfers, he said. I've been working on it every night, she said. I've traced 23 separate fund transfers from my inheritance account to Bracken's operating capital. I have the dates, the amounts, the account references. What I don't have is the corresponding land acquisition records deeds, showing when Bracken purchased each property, what he paid. She paused. If I can put those two things side by side, money out of my account, land into Bracken's holdings. It's not just embezzlement. It's conspiracy. The land records are public, Gideon said. County registrar in Briar Hollow. I can't walk into the county registrar's office, she said. Not with $100 finder's fee on me. No, Gideon said. But Pete can. Lenora looked at him. Pete Garland, quiet, reliable, the hand who'd told Gideon about Cobb without being asked. The man who'd treated her like a competent colleague from day 3. He'd need to know why, she said. Pete can handle knowing why, Gideon said. She considered it. She'd been considering trust at close range for a month now, measuring it out in small amounts, checking each increment before adding more. Pete had earned increments, enough of them. All right, she said. She thought about that, how trust worked in practice. How it wasn't a feeling that arrived and stayed, but a thing you built with specific evidence, the same way you built an account record one entry at a time, each one either strengthening the ledger or not. She'd been building one with Gideon, she realized, without deciding to. One entry at a time, she kept brushing Reckoning's mane. The barn was warm and quiet, that particular afternoon quiet that settles after the morning work is done and before the evening routine begins. He said something to me, Gideon said after a moment. When he was leaving, she waited. He said August Voss has a long reach in this territory. He does, Lenora said. He's also had 9 months since you left to consolidate that reach. To make sure the right people in the right offices know his version of events before yours. He paused. Lenora. He'd started using her name about 2 weeks in. With the same economy he used everything. When it was necessary, no more. What happens if we get the fraud filing done, and August still manages to invoke the incompetency statute first? What's the contingency? She didn't answer immediately. There isn't one, she said. If he gets there first with a court order, I lose the advantage. The ledgers become evidence in a proceeding where I'm already declared unfit to manage my own affairs. The judge decides how they're interpreted. She paused, which is why he can't get there first. And if we can't stop him. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it at 2 in the morning and 5 in the morning and all the hours in between when her mind refused to quit. If I can't stop him legally, she said, then I stop him publicly. She set down the brush. Reckoning turned his head and regarded her with those still cautious, still trying eyes. August has controlled me through isolation, through making sure nobody could see what he was doing. The one thing he can't survive is being seen. Gideon looked at her. What does that mean exactly? It means that if the legal protection fails, she said, I make sure that when he comes to collect me, he does it in front of every person in Briar Hollow who has ears. She said it quietly, without theater. The way you say something that you've thought through carefully and arrived at not from anger, but from a cold, steady, specific understanding of how power actually works. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That's a harder road, he said. Yes, she said. He'll try to make it about you, he said. Your size, your history, anything he can use. In front of people. I know, she said. And you're still... I've been letting him make it about me for 4 years, she said. In private, where I couldn't fight back and nobody could see. She looked at Gideon directly. If he wants to do it in public, then at least I'll have room to answer. Gideon held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, not quite admiration, which would have felt wrong, too close to condescension. More like recognition, like a man who understood something about a kind of stubbornness that is not the same thing as being foolish. Then we make sure the legal path works first, he said. And if it doesn't, he paused, then you won't be standing there alone. Lenora looked at him. Gideon, she said, when August comes, and he will come, I need you to do something for me. Name it. I need you to let me handle it, she said. Whatever it looks like. However it goes. I need you to stand back and let me handle it. He was quiet. This one cost him something, she could see that. He was the kind of man who stepped toward trouble, not away from it. Even if it gets bad, he said. Especially then, she said. He looked at the floor of the barn for a long moment. I'll try, he said, which was honest at least. I know, she said. She reached up and rested her hand on Reckoning's neck, the hand without the sleeve, the scarred one, and the stallion stood quietly under it. Didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just stood there and breathed, which for this particular animal was the same as saying, I'm still choosing this. Outside, the afternoon was tipping toward evening. Somewhere in Briar Hollow, Silas Bracken was sitting down to write a letter. Somewhere in Laramie, August Voss was waiting for news that had already been sent. The ledgers were in Gideon's lockbox at the bank, and Lenora had 11 pages of handwritten notes in her own careful script, cross-referencing 8 months of financial crime. The legal path was still the right path. She hadn't given up on it. But she had, very quietly, and without announcing it to anyone, started preparing for the other one. And Reckoning breathed slow and steady under her hand, and the barn settled into its evening sounds, and Lenora Voss stood in the last of the afternoon light, with her scars in plain view, and felt, very carefully, like something that had been running for a long time and had, finally, not stopped, but slowed down long enough to choose its direction. Pete Garland came back from the county registrar's office on a Friday afternoon with a folded stack of papers tucked inside his coat and an expression that suggested he'd thought about what he was carrying the whole ride back. He found Lenora in the tack room, oiling a set of harness leathers, which was the kind of work that looked like it required full attention and actually required almost none, which meant she'd been thinking the whole time, too. He set the papers on the bench beside her without ceremony. 14 properties, he said, all purchased by Bracken Cattle Company or subsidiaries thereof, going back 4 years. I wrote down what I could get purchase dates, recorded prices, previous owners. He paused. The registrar's assistant asked why I wanted it. Lenora looked up. What did you say? Said Rusk was thinking about making an offer on the Callaway parcel and wanted to know the market history in the valley. He shrugged. It's even true, more or less. Rusk mentioned that parcel back in spring. Did she believe you? She believed me enough to hand over the records, Pete said. He stayed where he was, which meant he had something else. Lenora, the Callaway parcel Bracken bought it 14 months ago. For $1,100. She waited. That number was going to mean something. Callaway told me at the time he sold it for $800, Pete said. He was complaining about it in the feed barn. Said it was worth more, but he needed cash fast, and Bracken was the only buyer. Lenora set down the harness leather, so Bracken recorded a purchase price $300 higher than what he actually paid Callaway. Which means $300 went somewhere that wasn't Callaway's pocket, Pete said. She picked up the top sheet and looked at it. Her handwriting, from 8 months of ledger study, was already moving through the numbers in her head-matching dates, matching amounts, finding the pattern that August had assumed was too well buried to find. Thank you, Pete, she said. He nodded once. He started to go and then stopped in the doorway. I didn't ask questions when Rusk told me to help you, he said. I don't regret that. But I want you to know I've got a daughter about your age back in Nebraska. She married a man that he stopped, started again differently. She's all right now. But it took a while. Lenora looked at him. I just want you to know that, Pete said. That's all. And he left. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of what he'd said without saying, the particular way men with daughters sometimes understand things that other men don't. Then she spread the registrar's records across the bench and put them next to her own notes and started cross-referencing. By midnight, she had it. 11 of the 14 Bracken land purchases corresponded within a 2-week window to fund transfers from the Voss inheritance account. The amounts weren't identical. August had been careful about that, running the money through an intermediate account with a different name, but the pattern was there, and the total differential between what sellers reported and what Bracken recorded added up to $4,312 over 4 years. $4,000 of Lenora's inheritance, laundered through false land records, documented in the county registrar's own files. She wrote it all out in the clearest hand she had, cross-referenced every entry, and at 1 in the morning went to knock on Gideon's door. He answered in about the same 30 seconds as the first time still dressed, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. She handed him the summary sheet. He read it standing in the doorway, holding the lantern. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Casper," he said. "Tomorrow morning, not you," she said. "You going to Casper is too visible now." Bracken's watching. He thought about it. Fenn has a clerk. "I'll write it all out tonight," she said. "Every figure, every cross-reference, a clear explanation of how the accounts connect. We can send it by stage with a cover letter. Tell Fenn to file the moment he has it. Stage takes 2 days, I know." She took the summer sheet back. "It's still better than you writing to Casper and Bracken, finding out before the filing's done." He studied her. "You've thought this through." "I've had all night," she said. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, use the desk." She wrote for 3 hours at his kitchen table while he sat across from it, reading through the registrar's records himself, occasionally marking something with a pencil stub and setting it to one side. They didn't talk much. The fire burned down, and he rebuilt it without being asked. At one point, he made coffee without asking if she wanted any, and put a cup at her elbow, which she drank without acknowledging, and neither of them made anything of that. At 4 in the morning, she had 31 pages of documentation. She signed the cover letter. Gideon signed beneath it as a corroborating witness, and they wrapped the whole package in oilcloth against rain. "Stage leaves at 7, Gideon said. "Pete can take it," she said. "He's already involved, and he won't talk." "No," Gideon agreed. "He won't." They sat for a moment in the kitchen that was now very familiar, the same table, the same particular smell of wood smoke and old coffee and working leather, the same quality of early morning silence that was different from nighttime silence, in ways Lenora had come to recognize. 2 days for the package to arrive, she said. Fenn will need at least 2 more days to process and file. Call it 5 days before we have the fraud complaint on record. And August? Bracken contacted him last week, gave him confirmation. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. August moves quickly when he thinks he's won. "So we have 5 days, Gideon said. "Maybe less," she said. It was becoming their refrain, she realized. He looked at his hands on the table. "I've been thinking about what you said. About handling it yourself. About standing up in front of the town." She waited. "I'm not going to pretend I like it," he said. "If August comes here with papers and men, and you're standing in the middle of a public square." "That's exactly where I need to be," she said. "You could still get on a stage," he said. "Go further west. Oregon, maybe. California. He'd have a harder time." "He'd find me," she said. "He found me here. He'll find me anywhere I go, because he has resources and time, and because what I took from him is not just a ward, it's evidence." She looked at Gideon. "And because running has never actually ended anything. It just moves the ending to a different place." He was quiet. "I've been running for 8 months, she said. "I'm tired, Gideon. Not of the work, not of this place." She stopped. "I'm tired of the running." The fire crackled. Outside, somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, one of the horses shifted. "All right," he said. "All right, I heard you," he said. "I'm not going to keep arguing for the option you've already decided against." He paused. "But I want to be clear about one thing." She waited. "When August comes," he said, "I'll stand back. I'll let you handle it. I won't speak for you and I won't step in front of you." He met her eyes. "But I will be there, and if it crosses a line, if he gets physical, if it stops being a legal dispute and starts being something else, I'm not going to watch that." She considered the terms. They were reasonable. She might have offered the same ones herself, in his position. Agreed, she said. He nodded once. She gathered her documents, wrapped the oilcloth package, and went back to the bunkhouse to get 2 hours of sleep before the day started. She did not sleep for most of them. August Voss arrived in Briar Hollow on a Thursday. He came by private coach, not stage, which would have required sharing space with ordinary people, and he brought with him the Cheyenne lawyer Dorset, a second man whose function was unclear but whose size made it obvious, and a document case that he carried himself, which meant whatever was in it was important enough to not trust to anyone else. He checked into the Briar Hollow Hotel at 10 in the morning. By 10:30, Ruth Callis knew he was there, and by 11 she'd sent her husband's delivery boy up the road to Blackthorn at a gallop. Lenora was working reckoning in the near corral when the boy arrived, breathless and pink-faced, with Ruth's message written on the back of a receipt paper. He's here. Hotel, brought lawyers. She read it. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She finished the session with reckoning another 10 minutes. Because stopping abruptly in the middle of something was bad practice with horses, and she didn't want to teach him. That work ended because of her distress, and then she led him back to his stall and latched it and went to find Gideon. He was at the fence line again. She'd started to think that was where he went to think. Today, she said. He turned. He looked at her face and didn't ask her to elaborate. The auction, she said. Bracken's annual livestock auction is Saturday. 2 days. He waited. I need 2 days, she said. I need August to think I'm uncertain. I need him to believe I might cooperate, might go quietly, might be the frightened girl he remembers. She paused. And I need him to wait until Saturday to move, because if the stage from Casper gets through tomorrow, the filing. If Fenn filed when he got the package, the complaint is on record, she said. 2 days ago, something shifted in Gideon's expression. You've been counting. Every day since we sent it, she said. He thought for a moment. If the fraud complaint is on record and August still tries to invoke the incompetency statute, it doesn't stop him from trying, she said. But it changes what he's walking into. It means there's a legal proceeding already underway. It means any territorial judge seeing both filings is going to have questions. She looked across the pasture. It won't be clean. Nothing about this is going to be clean. But it changes the calculation. And the auction, he said. Why Saturday? Why there? Because there will be 200 people, she said. Because Bracken will be there and he won't be able to leave without it, looking flight. Because the men who've done business with both of them, the ranchers who signed contracts, whose names appear in those ledger entries, will all be in one place. She paused. And because August thinks crowds protect him, he thinks numbers make him more powerful. He's used to being the man with authority in a room full of ordinary people. She looked at Gideon. I want to show him what ordinary people look like when they understand what's been done to them, she said. The letter came from August on Friday morning, delivered to Blackthorn Ranch by a hotel runner-a-boy who didn't know what he was carrying and handed it over cheerfully. Lenora opened it at the kitchen table, Gideon standing across from her. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph expressed what it called concern for her well-being and her long absence from proper care. The second paragraph outlined, in measured legal language, August's continuing guardianship authority and the consequences of her ongoing failure to submit to it. The third paragraph informed her that he would call on her the following morning Saturday to discuss a peaceful resolution, and that he hoped she would receive him without incident. He signed it your devoted guardian, she said. Gideon said nothing, but something in his jaw moved. She folded the letter and put it with the other documents. He doesn't know about the fraud filing, she said. If he knew, this letter would read differently. Then Fenn filed before Bracken could warn him, Gideon said. Probably. She pressed her hands flat on the table for a moment. He thinks he's walking into a negotiation. He thinks I'm cornered and tired, and he just needs to show up and be patient, and I'll come quietly because that's what I've always done. She stood. I need to go to town, she said. Tonight? Tonight, she said. I need to talk to Ruth, and I need to see the auction grounds. Gideon reached for his coat. Alone, she said. He stopped. I need to do this part alone, she said, not unkindly. I need to walk that ground by myself and think about where I'm going to stand and what I'm going to say when there's no one standing next to me. Because there won't be, not in the moment that matters. She met his eyes. Can you understand that? He stood there with his coat half on. She watched him argue with himself, saw it move across his face without resolving cleanly, because he was not a man who found it easy to step back from something he wanted to step toward. I understand it, he said. I don't like it. You don't have to like it, she said. You just have to let me go. He put the coat down on the chair. Take Pete's horse, he said. Yours is slower. Briar Hollow at 8 in the evening was not empty. There was light from the saloon, from the hotel, from a handful of houses on the main street. But it was quiet in the way that small towns go quiet after supper. A collective exhalation before the next day begins. Lenora rode Pete's horse to Ruth Callis's house, which was behind the mercantile, and knocked. Ruth answered in her nightcap and an expression that said she'd been expecting someone. Come in, Ruth said. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table with tea that Ruth made without asking, the way women of a certain practical bent make tea when something important is about to be said. Lenora told her the plan. Ruth listened the way she did everything directly, without softening her reactions or performing patience she didn't feel. Twice she started to interrupt and stopped herself. Once she got up to refill the kettle unnecessarily and then sat back down. When Lenora finished, Ruth was quiet for a long time. You know what they'll say, Ruth said finally. The ones who don't know you. When he starts. I know what he'll say, Lenora said. I've heard it for 4 years. It's different in public, Ruth said. Not trying to discourage her, just being accurate. I know that too, Lenora said. Ruth looked at her over the rim of the teacup. What do you need from me? I need people to hear it, Lenora said. Not from me. They won't trust me, not at first. But from people they trust. I need people who know Bracken's business to be standing close enough to see the ledger entries when I show them. I need the ranchers who've had dealings with him to understand what they're looking at. Ruth was quiet again. Tom Hendricks, she said finally. He sold the North Creek parcel to Bracken 2 years ago. He's told anyone who'd listened that the deal felt wrong, that the paperwork had numbers that didn't match what Bracken said in conversation. She paused. And Webb Alcott. He co-signed a supply contract with Bracken last year that had a clause in it he says he didn't agree to. Will they come to the auction? They always come to the auction, Ruth said. Everyone comes. She set down the cup. I'll talk to them tonight. I'll tell them to stay close to the main yard and to listen. Lenora nodded. There's one more thing. Ruth waited. If something goes wrong, Lenora said. If August produces a court order, if there's a territorial marshal with him, if it looks like they're going to take me. Then what? Then I need someone to get the documents to Fenn and Casper, Lenora said. Not the originals. I have copies. They're in an envelope behind the loose board under the second shelf in your storeroom, if you'll let me put them there tonight. Ruth blinked. You already put them there, didn't you? Lenora looked at her without quite apologizing. Ruth made a sound that was something between exasperation and respect. Yes, she said. They can stay there. The auction grounds were empty when Lenora rode through them at 9 o'clock. In daylight, with 200 people moving through, the place had a particular energy livestock calling, men arguing prices, the smell of animals and sawdust and competing ambitions. At 9 at night, it was just a flat yard with rope corrals and a raised platform at the north end where the auctioneer stood. She tied Pete's horse to the fence and walked to the platform. She stood on it. She looked at where the crowd would be, tried to feel the dimensions of it, how far a voice carried from this height, where the sight lines opened, where they closed. The platform was solid, not high, maybe 2 feet above the ground. High enough to be visible, not so high as to be untouchable. She stood there for a while. She thought about what August had taken from her. Not in the abstract, not the money, not the years, not the freedom. She thought about specific things, the way she'd learned to walk through a room with her shoulders folded in. The way she'd stopped eating in company because his comments about her size had made it impossible to swallow food while he was watching. The way she'd started wearing the long sleeves, even in private, even alone, because she'd internalized his gaze so completely that she could feel it when he wasn't there. She thought about the moment in the barn Gideon pulling her out of Reckoning's stall, The sleeve tearing, the scars exposed, and how she'd waited for the expression she'd always gotten. And how it hadn't come. She thought about Reckoning, who had decided after 11 days of nothing but patience and a voice that wasn't raised to move his jaw against her hand. Not because the fear was gone, because he'd decided to choose something other than the fear. She stood on the platform in the empty auction yard, and she said, out loud to no one, August Voss stole from my father's estate and put his marks on my arms and told me I would never be believed. Her voice carried in the night air, flat and clear and ordinary. She said he was wrong. She said it the way she said things to Reckoning. Not performing. Just leveling her own voice against the things she was afraid of. Just making it into something that had been said, that existed now in the outside world, and not only in the locked room of her chest. She stood there for another 5 minutes. Then she climbed down off the platform and rode back to Blackthorn Ranch. Saturday morning arrived with the specific indifference of autumn weather, cool, overcast, the sky the color of unpolished pewter. The kind of day that didn't dramatize anything. The hands were up before 5:30, which was normal. Lenora was up before them, which had become normal too. She fed Reckoning, first had been doing it that way since the second week, and he'd come to stand near the stall door when he heard her arrive, which was not nothing. She dressed carefully, not differently. She didn't own clothing for occasions, and she wasn't going to pretend this was a performance that required costume. She wore the same working dress, dark fabric, practical. She rolled both sleeves to the forearm before she put it on, the way she would for stable work, and then she stopped and looked at her own arms in the early morning light. The scars were there, raised and pale and unambiguous about what they were. She put on the dress. She did not roll the sleeves back down. She ate breakfast at the bunkhouse table, with Pete and Stetson and Cobb Rourke had left 2 weeks ago, packed his things one morning, and rode out without explaining himself, which everyone treated as a net positive. She ate well, which was deliberate. You didn't go into hard work on an empty stomach. When she came out into the yard, Gideon was there with the wagon already hitched. He looked at her forearms where the sleeves stopped above the wrist. He looked at her face. He said nothing about either thing, which was the right response. Ruth will have people positioned, Lenora said. I talked to Tom Hendricks yesterday, Gideon said. He'll be there. She hadn't known he'd done that. She looked at him. You said you'd handle it yourself, he said. I didn't argue with that. But getting the right people into the right positions beforehand, that's not the same as handling it for you. She thought about arguing. The distinction he was drawing was fine, but not without merit. All right, she said. They drove to Briar Hollow. The auction was already crowded by the time they arrived, livestock pens full and calling, men clustered in groups, with the particular animated disagreement that accompanied livestock appraisal, the auctioneer moving through warm-up calls at the edge of the platform. It smelled like animals and dry earth, and the sweetish undertone of wood smoke from the food stalls along the fence. Lenora saw Bracken immediately. He was standing at the north end of the yard near the cattleman's table, talking to 2 men she didn't recognize, wearing his good coat and his reasonable face. He saw her and his expression did something careful and controlled, the way a man's expression moves when he's filing new information. She saw August 4 minutes later. He was coming from the direction of the hotel, Dorset behind him, moving through the crowd with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided the outcome of a situation before the situation begins. He was wearing the Cheyenne suit, the expensive one. He'd dressed for a capitulation, she understood. He expected to receive one. He saw her. He stopped walking for exactly 2 seconds. Then he continued, and his mouth moved into something that was nearly a smile. Lenora watched him come. Her hands were steady. She noted this with some surprise. Not calm, exactly, not the absence of anything, but the particular state of a body that has been afraid for so long it has found the floor of the fear and learned to stand on it. Lenora, August said. His voice was the same, rich and reasonable, the voice of a man who was always the adult in the room. She'd heard that voice tell her she was too heavy to be attractive, too simple to understand accounts, too unstable to be taken seriously. She'd heard it every time she lay awake in the farmhouse outside Laramie, counting the days until 25. August, she said. He looked at her forearms. His expression went through something, not regret, she didn't think, but a kind of recalculation, the way a man recalculates when he sees that what he expected to be hidden is visible. "You look well," he said. "I look exactly as I am," she said. He glanced behind her at Gideon, who was standing 8 feet back, arms loose at his sides, expression completely neutral. At Pete beyond Gideon, at Ruth Callis, who had materialized somewhere to the left, with the mercantile's particular gravitational authority in a small town. At the loose constellation of people who had been listening to the conversation from the moment August said her Naetsim, Wad, because small-town auctions are not private spaces, and there is no such thing as a quiet conversation at full public attendance. He reached into his coat and produced the document case. "I have papers," he said. "Legal documents establishing my authority as your guardian and my right to escort you home." "I know what you have," she said. "Then you understand the situation is." "I understand the situation perfectly," she said. Her voice was level. Not raised, not performing, just level and clear and carrying the way voices carry when there's nothing suppressing them. "I understand that you have documents claiming guardianship authority over a woman of 23 who is competent, employed, and in possession of evidence of your financial crimes." The yard had gone quieter. Not silent livestock don't stop for human drama, but the human sounds had changed. The conversations nearby had stopped or slowed in that particular way of people who are now listening to something other than what they'd been talking about. August's expression stayed composed. He'd done this before, not this exactly, but pressure, confrontation, the management of difficult situations. He'd been doing it for 30 years. "Lenora," he said, dropping his voice, making it private. Intimate. The voice he used when he was teaching her something about herself she hadn't asked to learn. "You've had your adventure. You've run very far and been very brave. But you're confused. You've always been the stress of losing your father, the isolation it makes people see patterns that aren't there. What you think you found in my accounts is Tom Hendricks," she said. Hendricks, standing 12 feet away and slightly to the left, looked up. "You sold the North Creek parcel to Bracken Cattle Company for $800, she said. "In March of 2 years ago. The county records show a purchase price of $1,100. Hendricks went very still. $300 went somewhere that wasn't your pocket, she said. "I know where it went." She reached into her own coat and produced the documents. Not the originals, which were in Gideon's lockbox, but the summary she'd written at 1 in the morning 2 weeks ago, clear and specific, and in a hand that anyone could read. She held it up, not waving it, not performing, just making it visible. "I have the account ledgers from August Voss's business records, showing 31 fund transfers over 3 years from my father's inheritance account into Bracken Cattle Company's operating capital," she said. "I have the cross-referenced land purchase records from the county registrar showing the corresponding property acquisitions. And I have a fraud complaint filed with the territorial court in Casper 4 days ago." The quiet in the yard had spread further. Even the auctioneer had stopped. August moved toward her. Not lunge, not yet, but that particular movement of a large man who has decided to close distance. Dorset moved at the same time, angling to her left. Gideon took 1 step forward. Lenora raised her right hand, the scarred one, the one she'd worn covered for 4 years, palm out, in Gideon's direction. He stopped. She was asking him to stop, and he stopped. Just like that. And somehow, the doing of that, the being heard, the being listened to in a moment when it mattered, steadied something in her chest that she hadn't known was still shaking. She looked at August. He had stopped moving too. He was looking at her raised hand, at her forearm, at the scars in plain daylight in front of 200 people at the Briar Hollow livestock auction. The silence was absolute in the human register now. "He gave me those," she said, simply, the way you state a fact. "Over 4 years, when I asked questions he didn't want, when I pushed back on accounts I didn't understand, when I did anything that suggested I understood more than he needed me to." She kept her arm up. She didn't hide it and she didn't dramatize it. She just let it be seen. "He told me no one would believe me. He told me a woman who looked like me had no authority in this world, not over her own money, not over her own body, not over her own name." She looked at the crowd. She looked at Hendricks, who was pale. She looked at Webb Alcott, who had put down the rope he'd been holding. She looked at every person near enough to hear. I believed him for 4 years, she said. I am not going to believe him anymore. August's composure had not cracked. He was too practiced for that, but it had shifted. She could see it the way you see a foundation shift, not in the surface, but in the very slight wrongness of everything above it. She is mentally unfit, he said. His voice was still composed, still reasonable, still the voice of the adult in the room. She has been for years. These accusations are the product of a disturbed mind. Mr. Voss. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, measured, official, with the particular quality of someone who does not raise his voice because he doesn't need to. The man who stepped forward was wearing a badge. Territorial Marshal, seconded from Casper, arrived in Briar Hollow that morning on the early stage. Lenora had not arranged this. She looked at him with genuine surprise, and then she looked at Gideon, who was looking at the marshal with an expression that was carefully neutral, in the specific way of a man who had done something he hadn't mentioned. He met her eyes briefly. Something moved in his face, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. She would have words with him about that later. But right now the marshal was speaking, and August was going pale in the particular way of a man who has felt the ground shift. I have a court order from the territorial court in Casper, the marshal said, relating to an active fraud investigation under the jurisdiction of. August turned to Dorset. Something passed between them, a rapid, urgent exchange that was too quiet to hear, but whose content was evident from August's expression. And Bracken, who had been standing at the north end of the yard this entire time, who had been watching with the stillness of a man, calculating his options in real time, turned and started walking toward the gate. Stop him, Lenora said. The marshal looked at her. Then he looked at Bracken. Mr. Bracken, the marshal said, and his voice covered the distance of the yard without effort. I'll need you to stay where you are. Bracken stopped. He stood with his back to the crowd for a long moment. Then he turned slowly, and his reasonable face was gone entirely. What was left underneath it was something considerably less managed and considerably more honest. And Lenora watched the crowd see it and understand something they hadn't understood before about the man who'd been buying their neighbor's land and underpaying their contracts and smiling at them in church. August said very quietly and very precisely, in the voice he'd used when he was alone with her, "You have made a very serious mistake." Lenora looked at him. "August," she said, "you should talk to your lawyer." And she put her arm down. The marshal's name was Cord Pulaski, and he had been doing this job for 11 years, which meant he had learned to recognize the specific texture of a situation that was going to get complicated before it got resolved. This one had that texture. He kept his voice even and his hands visible, and he watched August Voss the way you watch a man who is very intelligent and very cornered, which is more dangerous than a man who is simply angry. Because intelligent, cornered men look for exits that aren't obvious. Dorset, the Cheyenne lawyer, had his hand on August's arm and was speaking quietly and rapidly into his ear. August was listening with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, not on Lenora, not on the marshal, not on the crowd that had closed in a loose semicircle without anyone directing it to. He was looking at something nobody else could see, which meant he was calculating. "Mr. Voss," Pulaski said, "the court order I'm carrying establishes a hold on any guardianship proceedings pending resolution of the fraud complaint filed in Casper 4 days ago. That means the incompetency motion your attorney filed last week is currently suspended." Dorset stopped whispering. He looked at the marshal with the particular expression of a lawyer who has just realized the timeline he was working from is wrong. "The complaint was filed Tuesday," Pulaski said. "Your incompetency motion was filed Wednesday. The fraud complaint takes precedence in territorial court by 48 hours. This was the thing Lenora had been counting on and hadn't let herself fully believe until this moment. She felt it settle. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of ground under your feet after a long time of not being sure it was there. August turned his head and looked at her. 48 hours, he said. Almost to himself. Not a question. The package left Blackthorn Ranch on a Sunday, she said. The stage made good time. Something in August's face shifted. Not breaking, nothing so satisfying as that, but a crack in the composure, hairline and real. The recognition that he had been outpaced not by a lawyer or a marshal or a powerful ally, but by a 23-year-old woman who had spent 3 weeks at a kitchen table, cross-referencing account entries by lantern light. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." "But the next part happens in a courtroom, not in this yard." She held his gaze. "With the ledgers on the table where everyone can read them." Pulaski stepped forward and addressed both men August and Dorset, in the careful, administrative tone of a man performing a duty he takes seriously. "I'll need you both to accompany me to the marshal's office. Not under arrest, not yet, but for the purposes of formal notification of the territorial court's order and the terms of the pending investigation." Dorset nodded quickly. August did not nod. He looked at Lenora for another moment with those flat, calculating eyes. Then he looked at her arm, at the scars, at the thing he had spent 4 years ensuring she would hide. She watched him look, and she did not cover herself, and she did not look away. After a moment, he turned and walked with Pulaski toward the marshal's office, Dorset at his heels, the larger, silent man falling in behind. The crowd parted for them the way it had parted for August on his arrival, but differently now. Not deference. Something closer to the instinct you have when something has been identified as what it actually is. The yard exhaled. Lenora became aware that her hands were shaking. Not visibly, she had them against her sides, but shaking underneath the surface in the way that bodies do when adrenaline has been running and suddenly has nowhere to go. She felt someone step beside her. Ruth Callis, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, not saying anything, just there. It was the right thing. Lenora was grateful for it in a way she didn't have words for. Then Gideon. He came to stand on her other side, not in front of her, not between her and anyone, just beside her. The way he'd said he would. She didn't look at him yet. She looked at Bracken, who was still standing near the far gate with a marshal's deputy she hadn't noticed before, positioned about 8 feet behind him. Bracken's expression had gone somewhere internal, that look of a man doing rapid arithmetic on what he still had, and what he's lost, and whether the numbers could be made to work. "We need to talk about the marshal," she said to Gideon. "I know," he said. "You contacted him. I sent a telegram to Casper 6 days ago," he said. "The day after we sent the package to Fenn. I told him we had a fraud complaint being filed, and that we anticipated the subject of the complaint arriving in Briar Hollow within the week, and that it might be useful to have territorial representation present." She looked at him now. "That wasn't part of the plan." "No," he agreed. "It was part of mine." She should have been angry. She'd spent 30 seconds deciding whether she was, and the answer she arrived at was contemplated. She was not angry exactly, but she wanted him to understand something. "You could have told me," she said. "You would have argued with it," he said. "That's not a reason to keep it from me." "No," he said. "It isn't. You're right." He said it without qualification, without pivoting to why it was actually fine. "Just, you're right. I should have told you. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with that direct, unsentimental attention he gave to things he was serious about. "Don't do it again," she said. "All right," he said. "I mean that. I know you do," he said. She turned back to the yard, to Bracken, to the crowd that was slowly returning to the sounds of an auction, though with a different quality now, more animated, the particular energy of people who have witnessed something and need to discuss it. Tom Hendricks appeared at her elbow. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the look of someone who had been carrying something for 2 years and had just set it down. "Miss Voss," he said, "that $300. "Yes," she said. "It's in the records, it is," she said. "The county records show the purchase price," Bracken declared. "I have your neighbor Webb Alcott willing to state what Bracken told him he paid for his parcel, which is a different number from what's recorded. When you add your testimony about what he actually paid you," she paused, "it builds a pattern. The court will be interested in a pattern." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "My wife's been saying for 2 years that deal felt crooked," he said. "I told her I probably just didn't read the paperwork careful enough." He paused. "She was right." "She was," Lenora said. Hendricks nodded once, with the gravity of a man acknowledging something that costs something. "You tell whoever's asking that I'll say what I know," he said. "In court or wherever they need it." He walked away. Webb Alcott materialized from the crowd, next younger than Hendricks, sharp-eyed, still holding the contract he'd apparently brought to the auction to discuss with someone who hadn't materialized. He talked to Lenora for 4 minutes. By the end of it, he'd agreed to provide a written statement to Fenn's office by the following week. 3 other ranchers found her in the next hour meant she didn't know who had dealt with Bracken on contracts, on water rights, on grazing arrangements that had turned out to contain terms they hadn't agreed to. None of them had individually been certain enough of what had happened to them to do anything about it. Seeing it named, seeing the pattern made visible in the ledger pages Lenora had been carrying for 8 months, gave it a shape they could hold. By noon, Lenora had 6 more names for Fenn's file. Bracken was not arrested that day. The deputy explained, with the precision of someone who wanted no misunderstanding, that he was subject to a territorial investigation and was required to remain in Briar Hollow pending the court's determination of next steps, and that his financial assets, specifically the operating accounts of Bracken Cattle Company, were subject to a temporary freeze under the fraud complaint until the court could review the evidence. Bracken listened to this with the expression of a man listening to weather he can't change. His lawyer, not Dorset, who belonged to August, but his own man who arrived from somewhere by mid-afternoon, spoke to the deputy for 20 minutes and accomplished nothing except to confirm that the freeze was real and the complaint was legitimate and that the 48-hour precedence problem was not a clerical error. What nobody said out loud, but everyone understood, was that frozen operating accounts meant Bracken couldn't make payroll, couldn't service his existing contracts, couldn't make the land payments still outstanding on 3 of his 14 properties. Creighton, Bracken's foreman, figured this out by 3 in the afternoon and had a conversation with his employer that those standing nearby later described as heated. By evening, Creighton was sitting in the marshal's deputy's office asking what kind of cooperation might be useful and what it might be worth to provide it. Lenora heard this from Ruth at 6 o'clock, when she and Gideon stopped at the Mercantile on the way back to Blackthorn. "Creighton's talking," Ruth said, in the tone of someone delivering news that was expected but still satisfying. "The deputy says he's got documentation of his own records he kept, because he didn't entirely trust Bracken's bookkeeping to protect him if something went wrong." "Smart man," Gideon said. "Dishonest man who was smart enough to have insurance," Ruth corrected. "Don't give him too much credit." She looked at Lenora. "The cattle records he falsified, Creighton says Bracken gave him specific instructions on how to record the transactions. In writing." Lenora sat down on the stool behind the counter that Ruth kept for herself and that she was now offering without ceremony. "Written instructions," she said. "Apparently Bracken wrote everything down," Ruth said. "He didn't trust verbal agreements, which is ironic given that written instructions proving you ordered fraud were considerably more useful to a prosecutor than verbal ones." "Yes, Fenn needs to know about Creighton," Lenora said. "The deputy's already sending a full report to Casper tonight," Ruth said. "Your lawyer's going to have a busy week." Lenora looked at the counter. The wood was worn smooth, where Ruth had rested her elbows for 20 years. She put her own elbows there and rested, and let herself be tired for a moment in a way she hadn't allowed during the day, because the day had required something different. "August," she said. Ruth's expression shifted. "He's still here," Lenora said. "He is," Ruth said. "At the hotel. Pulaski says the fraud complaint encompasses his actions in Laramie County too. The inheritance theft, the manipulation of the account records. He's technically free to go back to Laramie, but Pulaski advised him strongly to remain available for questioning." "Advise," Gideon said. "The kind of advice you take," Ruth said. Lenora thought about August in a hotel room in Briar Hollow, calculating. He would be calculating right now. He was always calculating. The question was what he had left to work with. "Dorset," she said. "Pardon," Ruth said. "His lawyer, Dorset. What's he doing?" Ruth considered. "Last I heard, he was at the hotel too. They've been in the room together for most of the afternoon." "Dorset will tell him the incompetency motion is dead," Lenora said. "The fraud complaint took precedence, and the protective motion from Casper makes any new incompetency filing an uphill battle. He'll tell him the ledger evidence is solid, and that Creighton cooperating is worse than almost anything else that could have happened." She paused. "And then he'll advise August to negotiate." Ruth looked at her. "Is that what you want? A negotiation?" "No," Lenora said. "What I want is everything. Full accounting of the inheritance. Criminal charges, the record showing what he did." She paused. What I'll get is probably something less than that, because that's how courts work. But the closer we are to everything, the better the something less is. Gideon, who had been leaning against the wall near the door, said, "Fen can handle the negotiation." "That's what you hired him for." "I know," she said. "You don't need to be in that room," he said. "I know that too," she said. She looked up. "I just want to make sure that when Fen walks into it, he understands that the position is not weak. That we're not negotiating because we have to. We're negotiating because it's faster." "I'll send a telegram tonight," Gideon said. "Tell him exactly that." She nodded. Ruth refilled the coffee cup that Lenora hadn't asked for, but had been drinking anyway. Outside, Briar Hollow was settling into its evening sounds, the saloon starting up, horses tied at rails, a wagon moving slowly down the main street. "There's something I need to tell you both," Ruth said. The particular weight in her voice made them both look at her. "After you left the auction grounds this afternoon," Ruth said, "I talked to 6 women. Not about Bracken or the money. About the other thing." She looked at Lenora steadily. "About your arm." Lenora held very still. "2 of them told me things," Ruth said. "About people they'd known. A sister, a cousin." She paused. "One of them told me about herself." The mercantile was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. "They wanted me to tell you that you weren't the first person to stand in that yard and feel like nobody would believe them," Ruth said. "And that watching someone say it out loud in front of 200 people," she stopped. She was a practical woman who didn't cry in company as a rule, and she was visibly working to maintain that rule. It mattered to them. That's all. They wanted you to know it mattered. Lenora looked at the worn wood of the counter for a moment. She thought about the 11 days with reckoning, working so slowly, building something so incrementally that progress was invisible day to day and only obvious when you looked back over the full span of it. She thought about standing on the platform in the empty yard the night before, saying things out loud to nobody. She thought about Ruth Callis closing her mercantile at 9:15 in the morning and walking 4 miles to bring her a warning. She thought about Pete's daughter in Nebraska, who was all right now after a while. "Thank you," she said to Ruth. It was the same inadequate phrase she'd avoided with Gideon weeks ago, and it was still too small, and she said it anyway because it was true, and Ruth deserved to hear it. Ruth nodded briskly and refilled her own cup and changed the subject to whether the stage road had been repaired north of town, which it hadn't been, and which gave all 3 of them something practical to complain about for the next 10 minutes, which was probably exactly what Ruth intended. August Voss left the Briar Hollow Hotel at 7 the next morning. He didn't flee. He couldn't. Exactly. Not with Pulaski's standing instruction to remain available and the investigation active. But Pulaski had not formally detained him, and Laramie was where his remaining resources were. And he apparently decided that whatever consultation he needed to do was better done there than in a hotel room in a town that had turned decisively against him. He was at the stage before Lenora knew he was leaving. She heard about it. From the stage office's runner, Ruth's network was impressively efficient, and she stood in the Blackthorn yard for a moment with the news and thought about what she felt. What she felt was complicated and not entirely satisfying, which was probably accurate. He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't broken down or confessed or done any of the things that would have made the previous 4 years feel balanced. He had simply left quietly with his document case and his lawyer, looking like a man retreating to regroup. Gideon found her standing there. "He's gone," she said. "I heard. Pulaski let him go." "Pulaski didn't have grounds to hold him," Gideon said. "Not yet. The fraud investigation takes weeks to build formally. Pulaski needs the full evidentiary record from Fen before he can make an arrest that sticks." He paused. "He'll go back to Laramie and talk to lawyers and try to find a way to minimize the damage. That's what men like August do. And while he's doing that, Fen is building the case," Gideon said. "With your documentation, with Creighton's records, with the testimony from Hendricks and Alcott and everyone else who talked to you yesterday." He watched her face. "This is the part that feels wrong because nothing dramatic is happening. But it's the part that actually matters." She knew he was right. She'd known it before he said it. That didn't make it easier to stand in a yard and feel August driving away on a stage, while the law moved at its own deliberate pace. "I thought I'd feel more," she said. "More what?" She didn't know exactly. Like it was over. It's not over, he said, but it's different now. 4 days ago, he was looking for you and you were running. Now he's the one who has to answer for himself. He paused. That's not nothing. No, she said, it isn't. She went back to work. This was one of the things about Lenora that the hands at Blackthorn had noticed over the weeks, that she went back to work. Not as avoidance, not as performance of toughness, but because the work was there, and it was real, and it required presence in a way that was useful when your mind needed somewhere solid to stand. She spent the morning with reckoning. The stallion had been unsettled by the 2-day disruption to his routine, her absence from the barn on Friday evening, and all day Saturday had registered with him the way changes in routine register with damaged animals as potential threat. She took it slowly, rebuilding the familiar sequence, talking as she worked, watching his responses and adjusting. By noon he had settled. She stood in the stall with her hand on his neck and felt him breathe. Pete appeared at the stall door around 1 o'clock, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had decided to say something he might ordinarily leave unsaid. Miss Voss, he said. Pete, what you did yesterday, he stopped. He was not a man who made speeches and knew it. My daughter wrote me last month. Said she'd finally told her neighbors what happened to her. Said she was tired of pretending. He turned his hat in his hands. I wrote back, but I didn't know what to say to her. Didn't know what was the right thing. Lenora waited. After yesterday, he said, I think I know what to write now. He put his hat back on. That's all I wanted to say. He went back to work. She stood with reckoning for another few minutes, her hand on his neck, the barn warm and quiet around her. The following 2 weeks were not dramatic in the way that Saturday had been dramatic. They were the kind of days that are necessary and unglamorous, the daily work of a thing being built, rather than the moment of its building. Fenn wrote from Casper 3 times. The evidentiary record was strong. Creighton's documentation of Bracken's instructions was, in Fenn's words, remarkably comprehensive for material the man assembled for self-protective purposes rather than legal ones, which Lenora took to mean it was damning. The cross-referenced financial records she'd provided, the ledger entries against the land purchases against the account, had been reviewed by a territorial accountant who confirmed the pattern she'd identified. The 4th letter came with a question. Was she prepared to provide a formal sworn deposition about the circumstances of their origin? Fenn explained, carefully and with appropriate delicacy, that physical evidence of coercion would significantly strengthen the fraud case by establishing that August had used methods beyond financial manipulation to control her, which spoke to the nature of the enterprise overall. She read that letter at the kitchen table at Blackthorn. Gideon was across from her, not reading over her shoulder, just there, in the same room, which had become a normal thing. She put the letter down. Fenn wants a deposition, she said. He waited. About the scars, she said, their origin. What he did. On the record, the kitchen was quiet. It'll be part of the permanent legal record, she said. It wasn't a question. She was thinking through it. Yes, Gideon said. She looked at her arm. The sleeve was down. She'd started rolling it back up in the mornings and sometimes leaving it during the day, and sometimes not, without making a rule of it either way. Right now it was down. That means it doesn't go away, she said. What he did. It's documented, officially. That means what he did doesn't go away, Gideon said. What you survived, that's already there. The documentation just makes someone else responsible for keeping the record. She looked at him. You've been keeping it yourself, he said. In your head. For 4 years. Letting someone else keep it officially, that's not losing something. That's putting something down. She thought about that for a long time. I'll write to Fenn, she said. Tell him I'll provide the deposition. She wrote the letter that afternoon. Bracken's operation began to collapse in the 3rd week, and it collapsed the way things collapse when the money stops. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a series of practical failures that accumulated into something irreversible. The operating account freeze meant he couldn't pay his hands. 6 of his 12 employees left within the 1st week. 3 more followed when it became clear the freeze wasn't temporary. Without hands, the cattle couldn't be properly managed. 2 ranchers who held supply contracts with Bracken, who had been unaware until now that their contracts were funded in part by money. Bracken had no legitimate claim to consulted their own lawyers and came back with demands for renegotiation. One creditor called in a loan on the east pasture property, then another on the mill site. The land Bracken had spent 4 years accumulating began to move back into other hands. Not quickly, not cleanly. Because nothing involving land and debt and territorial courts moves quickly or cleanly, but visibly and in a direction he couldn't reverse. Lenora heard these things from Ruth, who heard them from the web of practical information that a mercantile proprietor maintains simply by being the person everyone needs at some point. She heard them and noted them and felt about them what she felt, which was something short of satisfaction, but in the general neighborhood. It was not enough. She knew that. $4,000 of her inheritance had funded this, and $4,000 of land debt unwinding itself in Briar Hollow was not restitution. It was consequence, which is a different and more impersonal thing. Restitution was what Fenn was building toward, one evidentiary page at a time in Casper. On a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks after the auction, Pulaski rode out to Blackthorn Ranch and found Lenora in the south pasture checking fence line with Stetson Ranch work that never stopped regardless of what was happening in Casper. Pulaski dismounted and walked to her and said, with the economy of a man who respected other people's time, August Voss was arrested in Laramie yesterday morning. Financial fraud, 3 counts. His attorney is requesting a negotiated settlement rather than trial. Lenora looked at the fence line. It needed 2 new posts in the middle section. She could see where the ground had shifted, and the existing posts had lost their angle. What does negotiated settlement mean? She said. It means he pleads to the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, Pulaski said. Your lawyer would be part of that conversation. He'd need your instructions on what's acceptable. And the inheritance? Full restitution would be part of any settlement the territorial court would approve, Pulaski said. That's standard in financial fraud cases of this scale. She nodded. She noted that her hands were not shaking. She was not standing on the floor of the fear. Anymore, she realized she was just standing on regular ground, the way people do who aren't carrying something extraordinary. Thank you, Marshal, she said. Pulaski remounted, nodded once, and rode back toward town. Stetson, who had heard the whole thing and was pretending to examine a fence post with great intensity, said without turning around, You need me to go get Rusk? No, she said. I'll find him. She found him at the barn, which was where he usually was when he wasn't at the fence line, or the house Gideon spent more time in the barn than strictly necessary, which was something they had in common. She told him. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, how do you feel? It was a direct question. Not are you all right, which was softer and easier to deflect. How do you feel, which required an actual answer. She thought about it honestly. Like something that's been running a long time finally stopped, she said. And now I have to figure out what I do when I'm not running. He looked at her. What do you want to do? She'd been thinking about this in the margins of the past 3 weeks, in the early mornings with reckoning, in the small hours when sleep was slow to come. She'd been thinking about it in the specific way you think about something you haven't let yourself name yet, because naming things makes them real, and real things can be lost. Bracken's horse property, she said. Gideon went still. The parcel on the south road. His creditors will be looking to recover, she said. It'll come up for sale. It's got 3 functional paddocks and a sound barn and access to the creek on the east boundary. She paused. It's been badly managed. The animals he kept there were not kept well. I know, Gideon said. I want to buy it, she said. When the restitution comes through and the estate is settled. I want to buy it. And she stopped. She said the rest of it because she'd thought it, and it was true, and not saying true things had never done her any good. I want to take in horses, the ones nobody else wants. The ones that are too damaged or too difficult or too far gone, according to whoever owned them last. Gideon looked at her for a long, careful moment. Like reckoning, he said. Like reckoning, she said. The barn was quiet around them. Reckoning, in his stall at the end, made a low sound not distressed, just present. Announcing himself in the way he'd started doing, that low sound when he heard her voice. The restitution won't cover the full purchase, she said. I know that. But if the estate valuation comes back at what my father's freight company was actually worth before August, she paused. It should be enough for a down payment, enough to start. I know Hartwell at the bank, Gideon said. He'll deal straight. I know he will, she said. That's not the part I'm uncertain about. He waited. I'm uncertain about whether I know how to stay somewhere, she said. I've been moving for 8 months. Before that, I was trapped in one place. She looked at her hands. I don't know what I look like when I'm just living somewhere. When it's mine and I don't have to leave and I don't have to hide. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You look like you do right now, he said. She looked up. Standing in a barn talking about horses, he said. That's what you look like. She held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon light came through the barn door and lay in a slant across the floor between them, and reckoning moved in his stall. And somewhere outside, Pete and Stetson were talking about something practical and unimportant. And the whole of it was ordinary and real and hers. All right, she said. She went back to Reckoning's stall and picked up the curry comb and went to work. And Gideon stayed where he was, leaning against the post at the entrance to the barn, watching the valley go gold in the afternoon light, looking like a man who had arrived somewhere. He'd been heading without knowing it and found it acceptable. More than acceptable. Fenn's letter arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of November, and it was thicker than his previous letters, which meant it contained either very good news or a significant amount of legal language explaining why the news was complicated. It was both. Lenora read it at the kitchen table in the bunkhouse, while Pete pretended to repair a bridle across the room, and Stetson pretended to be asleep in his bunk. Neither pretense was convincing. She read it twice, folded it, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Well, Pete said, abandoning the pretense. August accepted the negotiated settlement, she said. 3 counts of financial fraud, guilty on all. 18 months in the territorial prison in Laramie. Full restitution of the inheritance principal, plus 4 years of accumulated interest calculated at fair market rate. She paused. And a civil finding of liability for the physical harm, which means the scars are on the official record as his doing. Documented. Permanently. Pete set down the bridle. Stetson, who had apparently not been asleep, sat up. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Sometimes news is large enough that the right response is just to let it take up the space it needs. How much? Pete said finally, meaning the inheritance. Enough, she said, which was the truest answer. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, the same place she'd carried the ledger summary for months, the pocket she'd checked unconsciously every morning to make sure it was still there. Old habit. She was going to have to find something else to put in that pocket, now that the thing she'd been carrying was finally put down somewhere permanent. She went to find Gideon. He was at the barn. Of course he was at the barn, and he read the letter, standing in the doorway with the morning light behind him, and when he finished, he folded it the same way she had, and handed it back without speaking immediately. Then he said, 18 months is not enough. No, she said. It isn't. The physical harm finding means it's on the record, she said. That he did it. That it wasn't discipline or correction or something I caused. She paused. That matters more to me than the prison time, if I'm honest. He looked at her. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because he spent 4 years convincing me that nobody would believe it. That I was the problem, my size, my stubbornness, my questions. That reasonable people would always take his side. She held the letter. The settlement says a court looked at the evidence and concluded he was wrong. That's the thing I needed, more than I needed him to suffer. Gideon was quiet. I know that might not make sense, she said. It makes complete sense, he said. Reckoning moved in his stall, that low announcing sound he made when he'd been ignoring the conversation long enough and wanted to be acknowledged. Lenora turned and went to him and put her hand on his jaw, and he stood for it the way he stood for everything she did now, not with enthusiasm exactly, but with trust, which was its own thing and worth more. I'm going to see Hartwell today, she said, about the Bracken property. Gideon leaned against the stall post. The creditors settled on a price. Fenn negotiated it as part of the restitution arrangement, she said. The court valued the property at $640. The creditor holding the lien agreed to $800 with a $70 a month payment structure. She paused. The inheritance restitution covers the purchase, plus the first year of payments, and leaves operating capital for feed and basic repairs. He did the arithmetic she could see him doing. That's tight. It's tight, she agreed. For the first year, it'll be very tight. She looked at him directly. I know that. I'm not saying don't do it, he said. I'm saying know what you're getting into. I know what I'm getting into, she said. I've been calculating it for 3 weeks. She paused. Reckoning is coming with me when I go. I want you to know that. He blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, that wasn't it. He's my horse, she said, in every meaningful sense. I know you own him technically, and I know what he was worth before. Take him, Gideon said. I'm not asking you to give him to me. I know you're not, he said. Take him anyway. He won't work right for anyone else at this point, and you know it. He paused. Besides, you saved him. That makes him yours in every way that matters. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to make that sound simple. It is simple, he said. Some things are. She held his gaze. She thought about the first morning she'd stood in that barn doorway, with a strange horse pinning his ears at her, and Gideon standing 6 feet behind her, and the particular quality of silence that comes from who is watching something without carefully interfering with it. She thought about all the mornings since then. Hartwell at 2 o'clock, she said. Do you want to come? He pushed off the post. I'll get the wagon. The Hartwell meeting took 40 minutes and produced a signed agreement of sale, contingent on the final settlement funds arriving from Casper, which Fenn estimated within 3 weeks. Hartwell was a small, precise man who wore his professionalism the way some men wear good boots practically, without vanity, because it served a real purpose. He asked clear questions, accepted clear answers, and treated Lenora as the principal party in the transaction, which she noted and appreciated without making anything of it. When they came out of the bank, the main street of Briar Hollow was doing its ordinary Thursday business around them. Wagons, voices, the smell of the livery, and the bakery competing in the cold autumn air. Lenora stood on the boardwalk and looked at it. 4 months ago, she had stepped off a stage into this street with $14.60 and the specific exhaustion of someone who had not slept soundly in 8 months. She had looked at the street in both directions, calculating exits. She looked at it now and calculated nothing. She just looked at it. You all right? Gideon said. I'm trying to remember what I thought when I got off the stage, she said. What I thought this place would be. What did you think? That it was far enough, she said. That was all. Just far enough. She paused. I wasn't thinking about staying. I was thinking about stopping long enough to rest. He was quiet beside her on the boardwalk. And now, he said. She looked down the street, past the mercantile where Ruth's light was on, past the feed barn where Tom Hendricks was loading a wagon, past the edge of town to where the road went south toward the property, with 3 paddocks and a sound barn and access to the creek. Now I'm thinking about staying, she said. Ruth Callis threw what she called a small gathering, and what turned out to be 34 people crowded into the mercantile on a Saturday evening with too much food and not enough chairs, ostensibly to celebrate the settlement, but actually, Lenora suspected, because Ruth had been looking for an occasion, and this was the best one available. Lenora was not comfortable with 34 people in any context, but she went because Ruth had asked and because Ruth had earned considerably more than attendance at a party. Tom Hendricks was there, and Webb Alcott, and a dozen other ranchers and their wives, and Pete, who stood in a corner with a plate of something, and the expression of a man who was happy about how things had turned out, and didn't need to say so. Stetson came, said 4 words across the entire evening, and appeared to consider that sufficient participation. Cobb came too, which was awkward for about 10 minutes and then wasn't, because Cobb was young enough that the horse had a short half-life. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had opinions about how it should be played, and they argued about it for a while in the way that fiddle players always argue, and then they played, and the mercantile got warm and loud and smelled like wood smoke and roasted meat and wool coats. A woman Lenora didn't know well older, probably 60, with the particular stillness of someone who had outlasted several hard things, found her near the back of the room and introduced herself as Clara Hendricks, Tom's wife. I wanted to talk to you at the auction, Clara said. But it wasn't the right moment. It wasn't, Lenora agreed. Clara looked at her with the directness of a woman who had stopped spending time on indirection sometime around 50. Tom came home that night and sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands, she said. I thought something terrible had happened, and then he told me what you'd said. About the $300. She paused. He cried. Tom hasn't cried since his mother died. Lenora didn't know what to say to that. He felt like a fool, Clara said, for not seeing it sooner. There was nothing to see, Lenora said. August hid it deliberately. So did Bracken. People with resources and patience can hide things for a long time. That's what I told him, Clara said. But also, she stopped. I told him that the reason he felt like a fool was that he assumed a man like Bracken wouldn't cheat him. He gave Bracken that benefit without earning it. She paused. The same benefit he didn't give you the day you showed up in town. Lenora was quiet. I'm not saying it to make you feel bad, Clara said quickly. I'm saying it because Tom knows it now. Because watching someone stand up in public and say the thing that nobody was supposed to say, it does something to people. Changes what they think they know. She looked at Lenora steadily. You did that, whether you meant to or not. Lenora thought about standing on the empty platform the night before the auction, saying things out loud to nobody. Apparently that particular practice had more reach than she'd realized. Thank you, she said, and this time it felt like the right size. Clara patted her arm once carefully, the way someone does when they're not sure the touch is wanted, and went back to find her husband. Gideon found Lenora 20 minutes later near the door, which was where she went when rooms got too warm. You're calculating exits again, he said. She looked at him. I'm standing near a door. You're standing near a door and looking at it, he said. There's a difference. Maybe I'm just warm. Maybe, he said. He stood beside her. The fiddle was going again, something fast and a little rough around the edges, which was the best kind. You talked to Clara Hendricks. I did. She say something useful? She said something true, Lenora said, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes harder. He looked at the room, at Pete in his corner, at Cobb, who had found someone his own his age to talk to and was currently looking like a young man who had recently learned something important and was still working out what to do with it. At Ruth moving through the crowd with the particular authority of a woman in her own domain. This turned out to be a decent place, Gideon said. It did, Lenora said. You could have ended up somewhere worse. I've been somewhere worse, she said. And then, because that was true but not the whole truth, also been somewhere lonelier than this. Which is harder. He looked at her. When you're being hurt, she said, at least you know what's happening. You can orient toward it. You can make a plan. She paused. Being alone, really alone, the kind where you've stopped expecting anything from anyone, that's quieter, and it takes longer to notice you're doing it. He was quiet. I'd started to think it was just what living was, she said. Quiet like that. Managing everything by yourself, not because you were capable, but because there wasn't anyone else. She looked down at her hands. I didn't know that was wrong until it changed. When did it change, he said. She considered. When you handed me your coat, she said. In the barn. Without touching me. Without asking anything. She looked up at him. You just covered me and turned everyone else away. And I thought, she stopped. I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Someone just does the thing without making you explain why you need it. Gideon looked at her with an expression she'd catalogued over 4 months direct, unsentimental, asking nothing she hadn't offered. The expression of a man who was serious about something and not performing the seriousness. Lenora, he said. Yes. He opened his mouth and then stopped. He looked at the room for a moment, at all 34 people, at Ruth's mercantile with its warm light, at the fiddle player making something fast and slightly imperfect, and then he looked back at her. Not here, he said. When I say what I'm going to say, I don't want to say it with 34 people in the room. She looked at him. Her chest did something she chose not to examine too closely. All right, she said. They stayed another hour, because leaving early would have meant explaining themselves, and neither of them wanted to explain anything tonight. They ate Ruth's food and talked to the people who came to talk to them and listened to the fiddle, and at 9 o'clock they said their goodbyes and drove back to Blackthorn Ranch in the dark. The wagon ride was 4 miles and took about 35 minutes at a reasonable pace, which Gideon set and then didn't rush. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear you only get in high country in autumn, where the sky is so dense with stars that it seems structural rather than decorative. The horses knew the road and needed very little directing. They didn't talk for the first mile, which was not uncomfortable. Then Gideon said, Without preamble, I want to ask you to marry me. Lenora looked straight ahead at the road. I said I want to ask you, he said. I haven't asked yet. I'm working up to it. Take your time, she said. He drove for another moment. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks, he said. I didn't say anything because there was too much happening, and because I didn't want you to think I was. He paused. Some men would see a woman in a situation like yours and see an opportunity. Someone to feel important around. Someone who needs rescuing and would be grateful for it. You don't need me to be grateful, she said. No, he said. I don't. That's part of it. He paused. I'm not asking because you need someone. I'm asking because you're the most honestly capable person I've met in a long time, and because I find I want to know what you think about things, and because watching you work with a horse that nobody else could manage. Or sit at a table at 1 a.m. cross-referencing account entries until you'd proven what you needed to prove. He stopped. I don't want that to be something I just watch from a distance. I'd like it to be something I'm part of. The wagon moved through the dark. One of the horses tossed his head at something in the brush, some small night animal, and settled again. What would that look like, she said, being part of it? Your property stays yours, he said. Your name stays on it. The sanctuary, whatever you build there, whatever it becomes, that's your thing. I'm not asking to own any part of that. I know you're not, she said. That's not what I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking what you want, he said, because I've got opinions about what a partnership looks like. But you've spent 4 years having someone else's opinions applied to your life without your consent, and I'm not going to do that version of it. She looked at the road. Stars overhead, the dark shapes of the hills against them, the familiar smell of sage and cold air. I want someone who argues with me when I'm wrong, she said. Not to control the outcome, just because they took the trouble to have an actual opinion instead of agreeing to keep the peace. I can do that, he said, possibly more than you want. I want someone who doesn't need me to be smaller to feel comfortable, she said. In any sense of that word. You are exactly the size you are, he said. I've never thought anything about it except that. I want someone who understands that some mornings I'll be in the barn at 4 a.m. with a horse that nobody else wants, and that's not loneliness and it's not a problem, and I'm not waiting to be found. I know what that looks like, he said. I've seen it every morning for 4 months. She was quiet for a moment. And I want someone who tells me things, she said. Even when he thinks I'll argue, especially then. A beat. The marshal, he said. The marshal, she agreed. Duly noted, he said. I'll tell you things. The wagon came over the low rise and Blackthorn Ranch appeared below them. The barn, the house, the pastures, the dark shapes of horses standing in the cold. Home, which was a word she'd been trying on carefully for the past month, wearing it in small amounts, checking for fit. Gideon, she said. Yes. Ask me. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of the rise and looked at her in the dark, and she looked back at him. Lenora Voss, he said, will you marry me? Not performed. Not decorated. Just the question, plain and direct, which was exactly how this man did everything, and which was, she had come to understand, one of the most specific things she valued about him. She looked at him for a moment. I don't need you, she said. I know, he said. I have my own property and my own money and my own horses and my own plans, she said. I know all of that, he said. I'm going to be difficult, she said. About the telling me things issue, and probably about other things I can't anticipate right now. Lenora, he said, I broke a horse that bit 3 men and I'm still working with him. I think I can manage. She looked at him. Something in her chest did what it had been doing more frequently, that particular warmth that wasn't sentiment exactly, or wasn't only sentiment, but was the specific feeling of a person recognizing that they are in the right place. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He leaned over and kissed her once. Nothing elaborate, just certain, and then clicked the horses forward down the rise toward the barn. The settlement funds arrived from Casper in the 3rd week of November. The purchase of the Bracken property was finalized the following Tuesday, with Lenora signing as sole owner her name, her land, her debt to service, her plans for what came next. She moved into the property's small house the next weekend. It needed work. The window frames were drafty, and the stove smoked on the south wind, and the floorboards in the back room had a soft spot that was going to need replacing before winter got serious. She made a list. She started at the top. Reckoning settled into his new paddock with the particular suspicion of an animal who has learned to regard new places as potential threats. And then with the gradual daily decision to trust this one, which took about a week. By the end of the week, he was standing at the fence rail in the mornings when Lenora came out, not demanding anything, just present. Just there. She brought 2 more horses in December, both from a ranch 40 miles north whose owner had died and whose horses had been standing in a neglected paddock for 6 weeks. Both were underweight. One was lame from an untreated stone bruise, and the other had the wall-eyed look of an animal that had been handled badly for long enough that it considered all humans the same category of threat. She named them, fed them, gave the lame one rest and the other one time, and did not rush either process. She had learned from reckoning that rushing the process was the one thing guaranteed to fail. Pete came by on Saturdays when his work at Blackthorn was done, not because she'd asked, but because he'd decided to. He was useful with fencing and with the stove, and he fixed the soft spot in the backroom floor on a cold Saturday afternoon in January, while Lenora worked the formerly lame horse on a long line in the paddock. When Pete finished the floor, he came and stood at the paddock fence and watched. "She's loading her weight better," he said, about the horse. "2 more weeks and she'll be sound," Lenora said. He watched for a while. "You hear from your lawyer lately?" "Last week." August started his sentence at the end of November. She kept her eyes on the horse. "He'll be out in 18 months. Pete was quiet. 18 months, he said. "Yes." "That's not enough," she said. "I know, it isn't." She brought the horse to a halt, let her stand, watched her breathing. "But he's convicted. He's on the record. He can't practice business in the territory for 5 years after release, and the civil finding means that if he ever tries to establish guardianship over another woman the way he did with me, the court record follows him." She paused. "It's not justice in the clean sense, but it's consequence, and it's permanent, and he'll carry it the same way I carry the other thing." Pete was quiet for a moment, and the carrying, he said carefully. "Does it get lighter?" She thought about that honestly. The way she'd learned to think about hard things without softening them into something easier to hold. "It doesn't get lighter," she said, "but you get stronger. And after a while you stop noticing the weight the same way, because you've built enough around it that it's just part of the structure." She looked at the horse. "Like scar tissue. It's there, it's real. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't." She paused. "But you can work around it. And sometimes the places that healed hardest are the ones that hold the most." Pete nodded once. He was thinking about his daughter in Nebraska, she knew. She hoped the thought was useful. "She's doing better," Lenora said. "Meaning the horse, but not only." "I know," Pete said. "Meaning the same." She and Gideon married in February at Blackthorn Ranch, on a day when the temperature was 19 degrees and the ground was iron hard with frost. And the ceremony was short because even Ruth Callis, who had organized it, agreed that brevity was a virtue when everyone's feet were going numb. Lenora wore her work clothes. She had considered wearing something different and then decided against it because the woman she was on the day she married Gideon Rusk was the woman who got up at 4 a.m. to check on horses and cross-referenced account entries by lamplight, and stood in a public yard with her scars visible and said the thing that needed saying. Wearing something that looked like someone else would have been wrong. Gideon wore his good coat, the same one he'd put around her shoulders in the barn 4 months ago. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he, but she noticed. Ruth cried, which she did in the brisk, efficient manner of a woman who considered tears a legitimate response to legitimate emotion and saw no reason to suppress them. Pete stood beside Stetson and was quietly pleased. Cobb, who was becoming less young every week, stood in the back and had the look of a man who was filing something away to think about later. When it was done, they went inside, and Ruth had brought enough food to feed twice the number present, and someone played the fiddle again, the same fiddle player from the mercantile party. A little better this time, or maybe just more warmed up, and the afternoon went on in the way that good afternoons do, without hurrying toward anything. Lenora sat beside Gideon and ate and listened to the room and felt it, the warmth of a place that belonged to her now, in the particular way that places belong to people who have chosen them freely. Not the warmth of being safe exactly, because she'd learned that safety was not a permanent condition, but a daily choice, a daily work. more the warmth of being located, of knowing, without calculating exits, that you were in the right place. Spring came early to Briar Hollow that year, March arriving with a suddenness that surprised everyone, and Briar Hollow Horsehaven, as Ruth had taken to calling it on the sign she'd commissioned from the cabinet maker without telling Lenora first, had 4 horses in residence. Reckoning. The 2 from the North Ranch, both now sound, both now manageable, if not yet easy. And a 4th a gray mare brought by a rancher from the Eastern Valley, who'd driven 2 days to find Lenora after hearing about her work from Tom Hendricks. The rancher's name was DeWitt, and he was apologetic in the way of men who are embarrassed about needing help. And he said the mare had been unrideable for 3 years, and that he'd tried everything, and that he was thinking about putting her down, and that his youngest daughter, who was 9, had asked him to try one more thing first. Lenora looked at the mare. The mare looked back at her, not wild, not rearing, just very still in the way that things become still when they've decided that movement isn't worth the cost. "Leave her with me for a month," Lenora said. "She's not worth the trouble," DeWitt said, but without conviction, the voice of a man saying something he'd been told rather than something he believed. "That's not a decision you get to make for her," Lenora said, without heat. "Leave her for a month." DeWitt left her. In the first week, Lenora did almost nothing with the mare, just existed in her presence, moved around her without pressure, let her watch and assess and reach her own conclusions. In the second week, she began the sequence she'd used with Reckoning, building it from nothing, adding one increment at a time, and only when the previous one had settled. The mare was not reckoning her damage was different, in character less explosive, more buried, the kind that comes from chronic low-level failure of trust, rather than acute crisis. Different problem. Same principle. By the third week, the mare was following Lenora around the paddock without being asked. By the fourth week, Lenora was on her back. DeWitt came at the end of the month, half expecting nothing, and stood at the fence and watched Lenora ride his daughter's horse at a steady walk around the paddock, and he didn't say anything for a long time. "What do I owe you?" he said. $30 for the month's board and feed," she said. "And you take her home to your daughter." "That's not enough," he said. "For what you did." "That's what I charge," she said. "I charge the same for everyone." He paid the $30 and loaded the mare and drove back east, and Lenora stood at the gate and watched them go and felt something she'd come to recognize as the specific satisfaction of a thing done well. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and solid, and accomplished with her own hands and her own patience and her own hard-built understanding of what broken things need to come back from the edge. Gideon came out from the barn, where he'd been watching through the open door. DeWitt looked like a man who'd seen something he didn't expect, he said. "He'll tell people," she said. "That's fine. More will come," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the idea." He stood beside her at the gate, both of them watching the dust of DeWitt's wagon settle on the south road. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me, that 19-year-old I was in August's house, wearing long sleeves in July, believing that nobody would ever take my word over his." She paused. She didn't know. She couldn't have known. That 4 years after that, she'd be standing on her own property with her name on the deed and a horse she'd brought back from nothing, and a man beside her who doesn't need her to be smaller. She paused. She thought smaller was the only option. Gideon was quiet. "It wasn't," she said simply. "No," he said, "it wasn't." She rolled up her sleeve, the scarred arm, the right one, and rested it on the gate rail in the early spring sun. She didn't think about it first. She didn't make a decision about it. She just did it, the way you do things that have become ordinary. The scars were there. They had always been there. They would always be there. They were the record of something real that had happened to her. And they were also just part of her arm, which was part of her body, which belonged to her and nobody else, and had been through enough to deserve to exist in the sun without apology. After a while, Gideon rested his arm next to hers on the gate rail, his scarred knuckles, his calloused palms, the particular evidence of a life spent in hard physical work. Neither of them said anything about it. The spring sun moved across the paddock. Reckoning called from his stall, that low, announcing sound, and Lenora turned and went to him, and he put his nose to her shoulder and breathed. And she stood with her hand on his jaw and felt the weight of what she'd carried, and the ground under her feet and the difference between the two. Some people spend their whole lives being made to feel like the problem is their size, their voice, their needs, their refusal to disappear on request. They carry this for so long it starts to feel like the truth about themselves rather than a lie that someone else needed them to believe. Lenora Voss had believed it once. She had stopped. Not in one moment. Not in the barn when the sleeve tore. Not on the platform at the auction. Not when the marshal read the court order in front of 200 people. It had stopped the way rivers change course, slowly and then completely through the accumulation of small decisions that each seem insufficient and together become irreversible. She had decided to stay when she could have kept running. She had decided to speak when she could have stayed hidden. She had decided to let someone stand beside her when she could have insisted on standing alone. And she had decided, this was the hardest one, the one she still worked at on difficult mornings, that the life she deserved was not a smaller version of someone else's idea of what she should want. It was this, the cold Wyoming air, and the horses who needed what she knew how to give, and the man at the gate who asked her questions and waited for her actual answers. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the specific and undecorated way of real things, everything. She never wore her sleeves long again.